The captain's orders, the soldier starts preparing the shots. Then the captain orders them to open fire. As a result, 4 rockets shot out, flying straight toward the horde of infected. The monsters barely had time to react. The explosions were brutal, tearing bodies apart, while the tanks pushed forward without mercy, crushing whatever was left in their path. But the destruction only attracted more creatures. The survivors began to howl, summoning reinforcements. The tanks got ready for the clash. The creatures ran, snarling, trying to reach the vehicles. The sergeant shouted from the cabin that they were pushing forward and ordered full fire. The cannons responded with a deafening barrage, clearing a path through the chaos. Meanwhile, a white van raced down dirt roads, being chased by a horde of infected. Suddenly, the dashboard signaled that they were running out of fuel. The driver shouted that they were almost out of gas, and Monk yelled at him to keep heading for the camp. The van sped up, passing a sign showing the way. The monsters didn't give up the hunt. Monk insisted that if they just pushed a little further, they'd reach the mountain camp. The driver apologized. He was the one who'd suggested that route, but hadn't expected the monsters to have reached it already. Monk turned to the older monk and said he also wanted to cook fresh food for the kids. The monk, embarrassed by the confession, thanked him for the support. Monk went on, saying there was still a lot of work to do in the fields, and that they'd have to shake off the monsters if they wanted to eat in peace with the children. The older monk agreed, noting that the little ones must be starving. The grotesque sounds of the infected were getting closer. When the van reached the camp, Monk shouted that the gate was open and told the driver to slow down. He turned around, pulled the curtain aside, and looked inside. He asked the children if they could run because once they stopped, they'd all have to bolt as fast as they could. The kids were terrified. The women nearby just sighed, having nothing to say. But Monk was determined. This time, he would save everyone. Even though the monsters were clumsy, they were fast. When the van finally stopped, the passengers jumped out immediately and ran as fast as they could, with the infected right behind them. Monk was carrying 2 children when he heard someone scream behind him. He turned his head. One of the monsters was almost on top of them. The creature stretched out its arms, breathing heavily. Without thinking twice, Monk put the kids down and told them to run and not look back. Then, he turned to face the monster, grabbed his staff, and with a clean strike, smashed the creature's head. Its jaw flew off with a dry crack. With impressive speed, Monk charged into the horde of zombies, forcing his way through. After clearing the first wave, he stopped for a moment. Ahead, more infected were closing in. He thought there were already too many monsters there, and there were still 6 minutes left until the dragon's attack. Then something caught his attention. Fireflies began to appear around Monk, lighting up the scene where he stood surrounded by the zombie horde. In the next instant, tornado columns formed, sucking the monsters up into the sky. Everyone watched in shock as the infected spun through the air like leaves in the wind. Monk stood frozen, surrounded by that magical glow, and then a figure appeared behind him. At the top of a building stood the protagonist, watching everything from above with his hands in his pockets and the blue sky behind him. In a calm tone, he commented that that ability was pretty useful. The fugitives and the bald man turned when they heard his voice, recognizing the young man from afar. Seeing him, Monk exclaimed that this was his benefactor, but the protagonist simply told him to step back before he got dragged in by the tornado too. When he activated the ability again, the monsters started spinning even faster in the whirlwind, and the fireflies glowed brighter. The scene looked like a living tapestry, embroidered with shining jewels. The protagonist, eyes sparkling, said, "I like this." Meanwhile, the military vehicles kept trying to hold back the monsters with bursts of gunfire. The sergeant, visibly nervous, shouted into the radio, demanding connection with the military network. He was calling for immediate reinforcements. They were being chased by zombies. That's when a rain of stones fell onto the convoy, and dozens of infected surrounded the tank. The monsters tried to break into the cabin while the sergeant ordered everyone to hold on tight. The stones kept falling, and the infected, even after slipping off the tank, kept trying to climb back up. Suddenly, the vehicle rolled over a cobblestone and tipped onto its side. The ones behind saw the accident and ordered an immediate turnaround maneuver. Meanwhile, Choi, unaware of the chaos, was in her car when she noticed her sword beginning to glow. Over the radio, they reported that the first vehicle had flipped. The car stopped, and the soldiers, confused, asked what was going on. One of them, nervous, muttered, "Captain, we're screwed." Zombies started climbing onto the car and were mowed down like bowling pins. Choi pressed a button that opened the window blind. That's when she saw it. Red eyes staring back at her from the other side of the glass. The infected were piled up on top of the vehicle. Choi ordered the door to be unlocked immediately, while a soldier complained that he should have known better after having nightmares the night before. The driver looked away from the zombie-covered window and said he was opening the back door. The door began to move slowly, and the guttural sounds of the monsters filled the air. Choi shouted for everyone to get back. The infected's decaying hands began pushing the door open. The soldiers, terrified, wondered how they were going to get through that. Choi then ordered everyone to go straight to Car 7 and to kill anything in the way. A yellow fireball formed in her hand. She yelled for everyone to spread out. Then, she unleashed a flaming column that swept through the zombies in its path. The soldiers were stunned by the girl's powers, and someone remarked that the path was clear now. She told everyone to get moving fast because more monsters were coming. She told the driver he was going with them too. That car was staying behind. Suddenly, one of the zombies jumped from the roof of the vehicle, trying to attack her, but Choi, quick as ever, drew her sword and in a single motion sliced the creature in half. The monsters started to surround her on all sides, and she cursed under her breath, annoyed. She spun her sword in a perfect arc, scattering the infected like leaves in the wind, and yelled for them to clear a path. Meanwhile, the sergeant in the first car was still trying to hold off the attacks with gunfire. He ordered the soldiers to form a perimeter around the vehicle. One of the soldiers approached to check on the survivors in the second car. Looking inside, he said that both the driver and the front passenger were dead, but the infected didn't give up. The soldiers struggled to open the car door without success, until one of them shouted for a blowtorch. They said they were from Group 7 and were opening the door, telling everyone to stand back. The others formed a human shield, trying to protect the survivors, but there were too few of them, and the infected quickly broke through the defense and charged forward. The remaining soldiers shouted to the captain, saying they were being crushed and wouldn't hold on much longer, but the captain stayed calm. He said this was no time to panic, they just needed to hold out a little longer. One of the soldiers, using his clairvoyance ability, looked ahead and announced, 40 meters left. More and more zombies appeared, surrounding the soldiers who fired non-stop. The sergeant drew a dagger and shouted for the soldiers to get ready for close combat. That's when flashes of blue lightning started to glow behind the horde of monsters. The lightning sliced through the infected like paper, scattering body parts everywhere. The phenomenon intensified until it consumed the entire horde. Shocked, the soldiers asked each other what was happening, until one of them pointed to the sky. Up there, people were jumping down from giant drones marked with the 707A symbol. The captain smiled in relief. Those bastards showed up just in time. One of the special unit soldiers landed on top of a car, surprising the troops on the ground. Meanwhile, Choi kept fighting the infected, cutting them to pieces, unaware that reinforcements had arrived. She spun to attack again, but her sword was intercepted by another soldier approaching from behind. Looking at his face, Choi thought, is that Jinwoo-sun? The soldier who had landed on the car said he'd handle the rest, and started preparing a device on his back. Jinwoo-sun then put his hand on the girl's head, pulling her close, and said loudly, "Shield!" At that moment, another soldier on top of the car fired several red spheres from his weapon. The balls flew toward the horde of infected but didn't explode immediately. They just kept moving forward as if they were carrying something. Suddenly, the soldier shouted, "Fire!" The spheres began to explode one by one, tearing the monsters apart with destructive force. Rocks, trees, and bodies flew everywhere. In the center of the blast were Choi and Jinwoo-sun. Soon, the place that had once been filled with monsters turned into a sea of flames and destruction. Drones and helicopters flew over the area, trying to communicate with the surviving soldiers on the ground. They requested a report on the number of dead and injured, but suddenly, one of the pilots warned over the radio, something unknown was approaching at high speed. Meanwhile, the infected that had been thrown into the air by the previous tornado started to fall from the sky. The protagonist smiled at Monk, who stared back seriously, both surrounded by the soft glow of fireflies. The zombies' bodies rained down around Monk like a grotesque storm. The orphans watched in awe and wonder. When they saw there were no more monsters nearby, they ran toward Monk, shouting joyfully that the monsters were gone. Our protagonist smiled and said that was fun. Now it was time to go home. Monk turned to him, calling him his benefactor, and asked how he had found them. At that moment, the other monks and children also noticed the protagonist and asked who he was. With a satisfied smile, Monk began to say that everyone should welcome him, but he couldn't finish the sentence. One of the surviving infected grabbed his leg and sank its teeth deep into his flesh. Monk looked down in horror, seeing the zombie biting his leg mercilessly. And while that happened, in a neighboring country, in Osaka, Japan, a new portal opened. the road began to collapse, swallowing whole cars. A gigantic monster emerged from the portal, spreading panic among civilians. A woman stumbled, and the stroller carrying her baby started rolling away by itself. But it was stopped just in time by Okita Hiro, who arrived right at the portal's location. The crowd cheered, shouting his name in relief. They were saved. Around the monster, men in black suits appeared, wielding swords. The creature lifted its head and spat out several fireballs. One of the men activated his stealth ability, and his swords were cloaked in black flames. One of the fireballs flew toward him and exploded right beside him. The creature kept launching flaming projectiles, devastating everything around it. But suddenly, other men in black appeared. They were clones. While the clones distracted the monster, Hiro closed in and sliced it in half with surgical precision. He swung his sword so lightly it was as if he knew exactly where to strike. With a series of swift blows, he tore the monster apart, which fell to the ground in pieces. Seeing this, the people cheered loudly. Hiro's name echoed everywhere. "It's Hiro's team! They saved us again!" Military vehicles approached the portal. On the news, reporters reported that a colossal monster had emerged from a portal and caused destruction. But thanks to Hiro's team, there were no major losses. Akiko praised Hiro, saying he had done an excellent job. Curious, he asked what she was watching. She replied that it was a video about the protagonist, and asked if he, the druid she'd mentioned before, still remembered him. With a smile on his face, Hiro asked, "Again? What happened this time? Did he get stuck somewhere?" Akiko replied that he had just come back from the dungeon. Hiro watched the video with a hint of disdain, thinking it was all so overdramatic. He had been there himself, so why make such a spectacle out of it? But something caught his attention. He asked the girl to scroll down a bit more on the screen. The image stopped on a group photo with the title, "In-Depth Analysis of Park's Guild." Hiro's eyes widened. He recognized one of the faces there. The girl asked if he knew anyone in the picture. Hiro was in shock. That boy, he was the eighth evil, no doubt about it. He remembered that right now, the boy should have lost his father and was living in an orphanage. That's why Hiro had put him last on the list to eliminate. There was still time before he would become the worst villain ever to come out of Korea, but now none of it made sense. That kid was a terrifying villain, the eighth evil. What was he doing there? Another face in the photo caught his eye too. Yang Jae-shik, introduced as the new member of the Suho Guild, and Hiro remembered him very well, the infernal swordsman. He also recognized Monk, who he himself used to call the Immortal Destroyer Monk. Hiro couldn't understand how all these individuals were gathered in one place, in a single guild. The girl then showed him the videos, saying she had compiled everything so he could see with his own eyes. Akiko commented that, in her opinion, either no one was controlling that guild, or it was something much bigger. In one of the videos, Park defeated a horde of monsters with ease. Next, there was a recording of a fight between Hiro and the Lizard King, where he threw the monster against a mountain. Hiro watched, stunned. The girl said, "Don't you think he's way too strong for someone coming from an F-rank dungeon?" He agreed. That wasn't the level of someone from such a low-ranking dungeon. Akiko said maybe he was an irregular, just like Hiro himself. The Japanese man started to think, what if he had awakened too but just hadn't been registered in the database? Everything made sense now. Park was also a regressor, just like him. What if he had come back to the past to gather all the villains into one guild? But why? The answer hit him like a punch to the gut. Park, just like him, wanted to change the future. If that were true, then the perfect plan Hiro had built to alter the past could be at risk. Akiko noticed he was tense and asked if he was okay. He took a deep breath, visibly shaken. He said he wanted to go there after the apocalypse. She was surprised by the comment and asked what was going on. Without hesitation, Hiro replied that he needed to return to his country. He had to talk to Park, but Akiko responded, serious, that it wasn't possible at the moment. Hiro, surprised, asked why. Back in the land of our protagonist, outside, the tree near Park's guild had grown so much that deer and even elephants began to appear in the surrounding forest. Refugees had set up camps nearby, including the orphans taken in by Monk. Everyone was amazed. There were elephants there, and fruits and vegetables growing in abundance. The children saw apples growing and asked if they could really eat them. Monk gave orders to build a lake, and the children squealed with joy, running around and pointing at the wonders they saw. Meanwhile, near the portal, the Reborn's department set up its base module. One of the soldiers reported that 37 squads of 20 people each had stayed in the dungeon for 28 hours, and that Park's guild cleared everything in just 2.5 hours. Another guy commented that the guild's 8th raid had lasted only 11 minutes. Miso, furious, calculated that if they kept this up for 10 hours a day, they'd finish everything in just 4 days. That's when she realized they had accepted the terms way too quickly. She muttered that it was urgent to impose a limit on the number of incursions. Meanwhile, Yang showed off his new weapon, the infernal blade. One of the boys commented that it suited him perfectly. Park said it was a welcome gift and asked if he liked it. Jang, excited, said yes. His previous sword was already dull, and Park had just given him this one. Han added that the sword would only unleash its full power when the user reached B rank. Until then, it would remain dormant. Yang smiled and said he'd do his best to reach that rank, thanking him sincerely. Monk turned to Park and said he also wanted to ask for something. His staff wasn't dealing enough damage, and he wanted a weapon with a better chance of landing critical hits. Jang, curious, whispered to Han, "Is he really a monk?" And Han, with irony, shot back, "Did you think he was a nun?" Monk said he'd love to buy a winged spear, but with his current level, it was impossible. Park then asked, "You mean that spear that costs 120 million? The one that automatically jumps to A rank?" A light flashed, and then the spear appeared in our boy's hands, gleaming and magnificent, a true winged spear. The boys all let out a collective, "Wow!" Yes, it was that same one, the legendary winged spear. Park handed the weapon to Monk, who immediately began spinning it in the air, testing its balance. Monk, loud and clear, thanked him, saying he would repay it with infinite curses and the blood of their enemies. Jang, once again in a low voice, asked Han what kind of curses those were, and he explained that Monk was a specialist in applying unique and sinister debuffs. Park then asked Han if he needed anything, but he replied that he'd already received enough. He raised the rifle in his hands and said he didn't need anything else. At that moment, someone asked why there was an elephant roaming freely on Park's property, but not even Park knew the answer. Meanwhile, Jang was thinking how surreal it was to see an F-rank group walking casually through level 4 dungeons. Park turned to his brother and asked about the medicine. Jang, confused, wanted to know why. Han replied that if they didn't take it willingly, he'd force them to swallow it himself. Two blades covered in a blue glow appeared in Junho's hands, surrounded by a sinister aura. Jang got spooked for a second, then Junho said, full of excitement, "All right then, let's begin." Meanwhile, Hiro was still waiting for the answer to his question. Why couldn't they return to his country? Back to their conversation, Akiko explained that all flights were suspended, and it was impossible to get to Park in Korea. Hiro hadn't known that, and didn't understand why they were blocked. She showed him the headline on her tablet. There had been a wyvern attack, and a commercial plane had been taken down. Akiko added that the problem wasn't just in the air. The seas were blocked too. She showed another article. A ship had simply disappeared in the ocean. Hiro read that, stunned. In his mind, he asked why the wyverns had broken through now. At that moment, he got a call from the minister. On the other end, the voice was urgent. The team needed to move immediately. A level 7 dungeon had opened. Hiro was in disbelief. How was that possible? Akiko was shocked too. According to his predictions, that dungeon was supposed to appear in 5 months. Looking at his phone screen, Hiro thought the timeline had changed. He compared the records with what was happening now. The wyverns shouldn't be out for another 3 months, and the army would need another month to contain them. If they didn't close that level 7 dungeon soon, the world would collapse. He realized it could only be Park. It was him. He had come back from the future, and if that was true, everyone around him could be exceptional individuals. But one question wouldn't leave his mind. There was only one time stone. Did Park come back 20 years ago too? Or did he come from another point in time? Did he know something that Hiro would only discover later? Hiro knew he couldn't ignore him anymore. He needed to find him as soon as possible. And if Park's goals were different from his own, he'd have to eliminate him, for the sake of humanity. He turned to Akiko and said firmly, "First, we'll go to the level 7 dungeon." She agreed, saying she would keep gathering data on Park. Meanwhile, our protagonist was inside the dungeon. He asked Monk to gather the monsters. The monk approached a bull, started hitting it, and murmured a prayer. But Han ran up to him and shouted, "Come on, harder, Monk, hit it like you mean it." The screams and sound of the staff echoed through the forest. Jang at that moment felt embarrassed about these guys. Didn't they realize how weird this looked? Han, looking down his rifle's sight, warned the enemies were getting closer. The whole team fell silent, watching the forest ahead. Han counted, 40 meters! Junho drew his blades, letting out a quiet laugh. Jang readied his sword, and Han announced, 30 meters! That's when the enemies appeared. A horde of lizardmen advanced with spears in hand. Han shouted, "We've got 125 of them coming straight at us!" Park raised his hand, summoning the spirits. They flew toward the monsters, and with his other hand, he activated the tornado skill. The lizard men were thrown into the air, spinning wildly inside the water. Han spotted one that got away and didn't hesitate. A perfect shot, and the creature dropped instantly. He cheered, 13 points for me. But the mood quickly changed. More and more enemies were appearing. Han yelled, "There's too many! Way too many!" That's when Monk activated his Dragon Rupture ability. A massive blue dragon appeared, lifting another wave of monsters into the sky. But not all of them stayed airborne for long. Bodies began to fall, and that's when Junho jumped into action. He ran toward the falling monsters, ready to carve a path through the carnage. Han turned to Jang and asked why he was standing there like a statue in the middle of the hunt, and that was exactly it. Jang had frozen up, only snapping out of it after Han's words. More and more lizardmen appeared, glaring at the group with hatred, ready to attack. Han fired back with his gun, yelling for them to just die already. Meanwhile, Junho was slicing through the monsters with his sharp daggers, chopping off arms with precise strikes. Suddenly, one of the monsters got too close to Han, aiming a spear right at his head. But Jang jumped in. He sliced the spear in half and in one swift move decapitated the enemy. Han thanked him with a grin for saving his life, but when he turned around, he saw Jang finishing off another monster right behind him. A second monster came charging right after, but Jang stayed focused. With a single swing, he took out another one. Han, impressed, thought, "This infernal blade is really working." And as he looked at Jang, he realized he's on a whole other level. In that instant, Yang remembered the past. Back when he decided to join a big guild and had that interview at the Scylla Guild. He thought no other guild would ever send an E-rank swordsman into a level 4 dungeon. But now, everything was different in Park's guild. When a massive lizard man appeared in front of him growling fiercely, Jang noticed the mask on its face. It was the Lizard Man King. That's when Junho came from behind, slashing the monster and tearing its arm off. And Jang, gathering all his strength into the tip of his blade, charged forward, yelling. He unleashed a brutal series of slashes. The monster's body was torn to pieces right there, in front of everyone. The whole group went silent, watching the blood drip from the decapitated king's body. But the most shocked of all was Jang himself. He could hardly believe he had defeated the Lizardman King with just one blow. Then Han, in a dramatic tone, complained, "Was it really necessary to kill him so fast?" With a sigh, he said that now he'd have to leave all those blood crystals behind again. Jang didn't get at first why he was complaining, but then he understood. Han smiled awkwardly and apologized. He said he'd just gotten carried away in the moment. A portal opened up beside them. A voice announced that there were 5 minutes left until it closed. Park ordered everyone to leave the dungeon, and the group started heading toward the portal. Han looked back, frustrated, saying there were 400 million worth of crystals left behind. Junho told him to let it go. They could come back for it later. Han, still hungry, said he wanted to eat some fish cakes and told Junho to come with him. In the middle of the conversation, no one noticed that Monk was falling behind. He was starting to sweat and limp. The bite on his leg was beginning to bother him. Meanwhile, another team was sweeping the dungeon. One of the soldiers at headquarters asked Group 2 for a status update. The reply was that they had explored 30% of Sector 3, and that if Park had found anything important, he would have marked it already. They also reported that they had already analyzed all the drawings in the caves and were moving on to the next sector. Suddenly, another soldier reported over the radio. 6 targets moving 70 meters from base at 4 o'clock. The white-haired guy heard the info and gave the order. Send 2 soldiers, take out the targets silently, and collect the crystals. Then he called base and asked for the location of the Lizardman King. The operator replied that the recon team had tracked the king to Sector 12. The man sighed deeply, put down his coffee mug, and thought out loud. The dungeon was way too slow. When would they find something truly valuable? But then, a strange sound interrupted his thoughts. He turned to check. Another soldier appeared, reporting that 8 lizardmen were approaching the base, 70 meters out. The guy wasn't surprised. He asked if the monsters could see them. He looked to the side, where a red light was blinking between the bushes. With the remote control in hand, he said that if they got any closer, they'd be turned into minced meat. That's when something slimy dripped onto his face. He looked up, and there it was. The Lizardman King, grinning with bared teeth, right on top of the headquarters roof, glaring down at the soldiers below. At the same time, the team was defeating more lizardmen and extracting the blood crystals from their bodies. Suddenly, they heard something in the distance and turned quickly, asking over the radio what had happened. The response came fast. The base had been attacked. They needed to start the defense immediately, but it was too late. An explosion rocked the headquarters. The captain cursed and ran toward the blast. The other soldiers followed close behind. More lizardmen ran toward the group, but the captain spun his axe firmly, ready for battle. He sliced through the monsters with ease, clearing a path to the destroyed base. He shouted for everyone to run. There was still time, but they had to move fast. Helicopters and drones from the 707A unit hovered over the landing zone, monitoring the situation. A new wave of infected was approaching the soldiers. One of them remarked that the zombies were falling back, while another yelled that the wounded needed to be evacuated by helicopter as soon as possible. The troops tried to prevent the infected from escaping, opening fire on anything that moved. Jin Woo-sun informed Choi that they had received an SOS signal during an aerial mission and had arrived at the last second. Choi replied that they were about to rendezvous with the SDS group, but the young man explained that the CDC was in full operation. They had to work simultaneously in 5 level 2 dungeons. Suddenly, everyone looked up. A fireball was heading straight for the helicopter. The impact was devastating. The aircraft exploded in mid-air, and its debris scattered everywhere, leaving the soldiers completely stunned. That's when a massive creature emerged from the trees, launching fireballs in all directions. Inside the base, in front of a darkened screen, a soldier reported to Miso that that was the last recording, captured by one of the soldiers with the ability to transmit data in real time. Miso asked if they had at least learned anything new from it, but the answer was disheartening. Not yet. They would only have more information once the site was fully cleared. Losing her patience, she demanded to know why the groups had changed routes and ended up right there. The soldier began to explain that the instructors thought it was a mistake, but Miso exploded with rage. She shouted, asking who, after all, had authorized entry into the zombie red zone. She swore that if that idiot came back alive, she'd deal with him herself. She tried to make a call, but all she heard was a recording saying the device was turned off. She let out a heavy sigh, asking herself what was wrong with Choi and why this always happened with her. Meanwhile, the phone she was trying to reach was destroyed, lying in a pool of blood. Back at the dungeon base, chaos reigned. Destroyed equipment, everything covered in blood. A soldier, missing an arm, staggered out of the makeshift headquarters trying to stifle his screams. Behind him, the Lizardman King charged forward like a hurricane. The monster easily caught up with the soldier and knocked him down with one paw. But the young man seemed ready for this moment. With a dark smile, he pressed a red button on the remote control. The Lizardman King turned, realizing the danger, but it was too late. His entire body ignited and disintegrated in front of everyone. At that moment, the captain, the one with hair like Kakashi, and his team arrived at the destroyed HQ and were shocked to see the king's head lying on the ground. One of the soldiers reported that a portal had appeared 120 meters away, with only 10 minutes left before it closed. The captain, irritated, muttered that this was all a disgrace. Meanwhile, at the defense HQ in the capital, Miso was driving when she got a call and answered through her headset. On the other end, a soldier informed her the first group had returned, but 2 were dead and 2 more were critically injured. The girl was shocked by the number of casualties. How could something like this happen in a level 4 dungeon? The sergeant explained they had to split into 2 groups, one for combat, the other for recon, and in 2 hours, they'd be going back down again. Miso asked them to delay it. She needed to secure reinforcements first. She asked what the other groups were doing. The reply was curt. Everyone was on an incursion. She wanted to know if they had found anything valuable, but the soldier said they were too busy defending the base. There was no other relevant report at the moment. He added that they had confirmed the time distortions. Group 1 had spent 48 hours inside the dungeon, but only 24 hours had passed in the real world. Miso thought to herself. When she went into the dungeon herself, time had been moving twice as fast inside. Park had disappeared for 10 years, which meant he'd spent 20 years in there. She remembered his words, that it was necessary to train for 1,000 years to become strong. Now it all made sense. If that was true, he must have trained for 500 real years. How could someone spend 1,000 years inside a dungeon? She said out loud, Park's guild is way ahead. Even if they increased the number of mercenaries, they'd still be behind. They'd have to push hard to catch up with that guy. Another soldier confirmed, Park's team had cleared the dungeon 50 times and in just 7 hours. They had just reported that they were leaving the island dungeon. The next destination? The Awakened Department, where they'd update the warriors' records. Miso was in shock. They were leaving, again. And at that exact moment, it was Junho who was driving. He had gained an increase in his stats. The guys were sleeping in the back seat of the car. Everyone's levels had also gone up. Park turned to Jang and asked if he was tired. A bit awkward, the boy answered that all of this felt like a dream. Park raised an eyebrow, curious, and asked, "A dream? What do you mean?" Jang, embarrassed, explained that he had spent the last 14 years just existing. He had never even stepped into a level 3 or level 4 dungeon. And now, in a single day, he'd entered a level 4 dungeon 50 times. The lizardmen he faced there were as strong as dungeon bosses from first or second level dungeons. For 3 years he'd been struggling, barely managing to reach E rank. But with Park's guild, he jumped to D rank in just a few hours. He said that if he had gone to the Scylla guild, he wouldn't have even finished training on time. Then he asked, blushing, "This isn't a dream, right? If you want, I'll hit you," said our protagonist. But Jang, laughing, said he'd rather keep dreaming if that was the case. The car arrived at the awakened department, and Junho yelled for everyone to wake up. Park told the sleepyheads to finish that process quickly, because after that they'd go eat lobster. In the energy measurement room, just like before, lightning danced through the air, and within the sparks, mysterious eyes could be seen. Park heard voices through the device and thought, the stronger he got, the clearer those voices became. He remembered Miso's words. That device would be built by an English scientist, and she'd let him know when she could set up a meeting. Park was determined. He wanted to go to England and meet this guy. Han saw the test results and commented, "This number is way above C rank, so why'd they only give you that?" But even so, he congratulated him. Park thought it was funny. Only now they were figuring out his level. Apparently only he could see other people's levels. He approached the staff member and asked who had created their system. Han, surprised, said it seemed like it had been there since the moment of awakening. The staff member replied that it was more of an internal legend. They called it the Godstone. After the Great Cataclysm, this item was found. It was responsible for the development of spatial engineering. Han said he'd heard about that before. Park, intrigued, asked, "What exactly is this stone?" The staff member explained, after the Great Cataclysm, a red stone with inscriptions appeared somewhere in Europe. Since then, every awakened individual in Europe had an integrated interface. Survivors believed this stone was a kind of divine message, with commandments inscribed on it. After decoding those commandments, fragments of the stone were spread around the world. Thanks to that, the awakened could access their interfaces. A piece of that stone was installed directly in the department's system processor, and that's what allowed the awakened's interfaces to work. The group was stunned. None of them had any idea about this. Park then asked the scientist what exactly had been deciphered. He replied, "The foundations of the dungeon world, the level system, the use of spatial energy, all of it was there." Park reflected out loud. So, all of this was part of God's plan? Leaving the building, the boys were still discussing what they had just heard. Park asked how someone could even find God. Han replied, "Probably, only after you die." In his thoughts, Park wondered, what if it was possible to create an artificial awaken by injecting atomic energy during a raid? But Han shot that idea down. He said that was fiction. Awakening required special conditions. Park changed the subject and congratulated everyone on their new levels. Jang was still repeating that it all felt like a dream, and Park, laughing, asked how many times he was going to say that. Junho commented that now his level was reset, and the others were surprised. He said his level had increased. Park asked if he remembered the orc dungeon, and Junho replied, "You really want to go back there again?" Park, with a smile on his face, said that now, with his new level, he was strong enough to tame even more wolves. It was time to expand the family. Han asked what they should do, and Park answered, "Go on raids with Yang. He needs to gain experience points and improve team synergy." Jang, grateful, called Park captain, and Junho added, "Yeah, it's good to raid with Park." Han, excited, said that with the new level, the government benefits would also increase. But Junho shot back, "And what for, if we already made way more inside the dungeon?" Han thought for a moment, and ended up agreeing, "True, we're rich now." Monk, with that serious vibe, said that by his calculations, the group had earned about 5 billion. Han added that they'd also gotten a bunch of blood crystals. Junho turned to Yang and said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you. The guild keeps half of everything. The rest we split between the raid participants." Jang was in shock when he saw that 500 million had been transferred to him. He even commented, embarrassed, that he hadn't done anything to deserve it. Han said that Park was simply a very generous person, but even so, Jang couldn't accept those terms. Suddenly, our boy shouted at the top of his lungs, "I'm hungry!" and called everyone to go eat lobster. At that moment, Han grabbed his head with both hands and screamed that he had forgotten something important. The others turned, startled, asking what had happened. Tears streamed down Han's face. He said dramatically that he'd probably be killed soon. The guys looked at each other, confused, and asked why anyone would want to kill him. Soon after, the group arrived at a restaurant. The place was getting busier and busier, and in the distance, a portal glowed brightly. The boys gathered around Han's laptop, and Jang widened his eyes at the amount he saw on the screen. Junho, incredulous, read out loud the names of the senders of the transfers. With a tearful voice, Han said the money probably came from the Yakuza. Junho asked what the Yakuza had to do with a hunter who had just returned, and Han explained that, from the messages, they were interested in Park's ability to cultivate plants. Now that a huge cultivable area had been destroyed, most of the food came from planet Aruka, and Park's ability could solve any country's supply problem. Han also added, with a nervous smile, that as long as they stayed by Park's side, no crisis would ever be truly terrifying. Our protagonist then asked why he thought he'd be killed. Han explained, that money was just the beginning. They wanted to talk to him, and if he didn't show up in 2 days, he'd be dead. Park, serious, said he'd already made it clear he wouldn't go to them. Han added that they kept insisting and reminded everyone that one day, drunk, he'd sent a message saying Park didn't even have money to meet them. Jang was shocked. Park, as calm as ever, asked what exactly they wanted from him. Han pleaded, record a video for them, or they'll do something terrible to me. Our boy agreed on the spot. Han jumped up, bowed deeply, and thanked him with teary eyes, saying he'd use all the money for the guild's benefit. Still emotional, he said he should even change the channel name to Park's Guild. Park, impatient, told them to finish it quickly so they could go eat lobster. The others agreed. They were starving. Han set up the camera and started recording. He greeted the sponsors, introduced himself, and pulled Park forward, saying he was the man everyone was waiting for. He said he'd leave the rest of the message to him and stepped out of frame. Park stared at the camera and, without hesitation, said, I'm not going anywhere. Then he turned his back and added, that's it. Now let's go eat lobster. Han froze. That's it? He asked, incredulous. The others didn't understand what was wrong either. John commented that Park got straight to the point, and Monk added that he was hungry and hurried the group. At that moment, Han received a message. He read it out loud. If Park doesn't want to go to them, then they'll come to him. They want to know if he's okay with that. Everyone immediately turned, surprised by the proposal. Han said they were willing to come there and wanted to have a serious talk with Park. Our hero replied indifferently, tell them it's fine by me. And as he walked away, he added, who's gonna stop them if they decide to come? When they arrived at the cafe, Junho asked which country those messages came from. Han answered that it seemed to be the same place where Hero had gone. The group didn't even notice that a man, sitting at the next table, was watching everything carefully. Night began to fall over the city, and cars sped down the avenues. Inside one of them, a young man was talking on the phone with his superior, saying he was already on his way. When he hung up, he frowned angrily. He muttered that old man was driving him crazy, then turned to the driver. I'm exhausted today. We're going to the club. But the phone rang again. He answered, annoyed. It was a man calling directly from a cafe. He told the director that he had found Park. The director, surprised, asked where he was. The answer, after dinner with the guild, he's heading to the dungeon. The director wanted to know which dungeon, and the man replied, it seemed to be the same one where an incident had happened recently. The director smiled and ordered his subordinate, keep him there. Meanwhile, inside the DGB building, a man sitting in an armchair picked up the phone and asked the director how he could help. The director answered, it looks like we have a member of the vitamin group, Song-yi. In her last interview, she said she liked Park. The man in the chair confirmed, yes, that's right, she really did say that. The director mentioned that they'd soon be releasing a new song, and this time, he was thinking about using the scandal as the basis for an advertising campaign. The man, frowning, couldn't understand what was going on in his boss's head. The director then turned to the driver and told him to turn around. They needed to pick up a client. The car swerved sharply and sped off in the right direction. Meanwhile, the guy in the car got another call from the chairman. He answered, greeting the chairman. On the other end, the old man was already yelling, calling him a bastard and asking why he hadn't arrived yet. The man calmly replied that he was dedicating himself to the DGB and asked why all the swearing. The furious old man screamed again, accusing him of conspiring against him once more. He ordered him to come see him immediately, threatening that if he went anywhere else, he wouldn't leave alive. The director tried to calm him down, saying that after all, he was his son and also the DGB Corporation's vice president. He promised that this time he'd actually do something useful for the company. But the chairman, confused, asked what he was talking about. With a sly smile, his son answered that he wanted to recruit the protagonist. The old man exploded again, asking if he thought things were that simple, and revealed that he'd already sent a manager to handle it. Tired of the yelling, the son hung up on his father, furious at the lack of trust. Staring at his phone screen, he muttered about how someone could be treated that way by their own family. Right after, Song-yi called him, calling him brother. The man smiled when he heard her voice and asked how she was. The girl wanted to know if it was true that he wanted to introduce her to Park Suho. He confirmed it, saying he was on his way to pick her up and asked her to get ready. After the call, he angrily replayed the conversation with his father in his head, annoyed at the manager. How dare that old fox interfere with his plans? In his mind, the young should be the ones talking among themselves. Not even Park Suho could resist the charm of the idol from the Vita group. If everything went well, he wouldn't have to bow to his father anymore. Power would finally be within his reach. Meanwhile, in a dark, abandoned dungeon, the tall buildings were covered in vegetation, and a buzzing echoed through the area. The noise came from a helicopter hovering overhead, closely watched by monsters peeking through the windows. glowing spheres started dropping, scattering through the air. Each sphere emitted an infrared glow. On the helicopter's screen, an image appeared, and the pilot reported that there were goblins everywhere. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The pilot wondered why such well-trained soldiers, with the best equipment, were being sent to hunt down one single guy. Suddenly, in the ultraviolet spectrum, the image of a person appeared. The pilot shouted, ordering a turn to the left, and the glowing sphere redirected its red light. There was a man, crouched in a corner, with a huge scar on his face. Annoyed at being found, he grumbled that first they used him, and now they were after him again. From the helicopter, the soldiers ordered him to stay put because they were going to rescue him. The pilot cursed the situation, saying the guy was surrounded by goblins. And at that exact moment, a goblin's face popped up right in front of the scarred man. The soldiers yelled, demanding more speed to reach him in time. The man pulled out his pistol and started shooting frantically. He killed the nearest goblins and took off running, trying to escape. But the creatures weren't about to let him go. They chased after him, nearly catching him. From above, the helicopter closed in on the chase. The man ran as fast as he could until a goblin almost struck him with an axe. He spun around and fired again, taking out more enemies. He ran up a staircase, shooting to keep the monsters back. But luck wasn't on his side. He tripped and fell to the ground. The pistol flew out of reach, and he didn't even have time to get up. The goblin caught up to him and opened its jaws wide, ready to kill him. But at the last second, the goblin's head exploded with a perfect shot. With the sound of shattering glass, a team of soldiers burst through the building's windows. The man recognized them as the old DGB team, and he realized he had nowhere left to run. He let out a curse. Then he died of natural causes. Meanwhile, a black car sped through the city streets. On the dashboard, an image of Group X appeared. The man answered the call and heard the voice on the other end say, it was Group X. They reported that the target had been captured. The man praised their work and told them to take him to the warehouse. Meanwhile, the director scolded the manager, wanting to know what he had done. The man, irritated, explained that he'd only asked the manager to hold Park until he arrived. The manager then remembered when Park had walked toward the portal, quietly saying he'd go alone. He called out to him, but Park just looked over his shoulder, took a business card from the DGB company, and completely ignored him. He stepped into the portal and vanished like a blur. The manager, guilt in his voice, explained that the protagonist disappeared in the blink of an eye without even listening. The director turned away, saying he didn't want to hear excuses, and the manager just apologized again. When asked how long it took the last time, the manager said that in pairs, it had taken 4 days. The man made a face. Alone, it would take at least 8 days. The director, shocked, wondered if Park had really gone into that dungeon alone, and a level 5 one no less. At that moment, the car window rolled down, and a girl asked when she'd get to see Park. Without even turning around, the director, eyes closed, called her Spark, and said the protagonist was already inside the dungeon, standing on a mountain of dead goblins. Inside, Park was analyzing his abilities. He already had all his druid points, but still needed more experience. That's when he felt something moving beneath the corpses. With a curious smile, he asked if there was still someone there and activated his tracking skill. In the middle of the pile, a wounded goblin appeared. Somehow, it was still alive. Without wasting time, Park lunged with his axe. The goblin didn't even have time to react. The strike was so strong that it shredded not only him, but the bodies around him too. Park pulled out a blood-soaked stone, and seeing the notification, celebrated. 23 experience points. It was exactly what he needed. The stone disappeared from his hand and was automatically transferred to the guild's point bank. With that, he now had enough points, and the system offered to unlock a new hunting area for 5,000 points. Park accepted. The map opened up, and he chose the location, Park's Land. The message confirmed that the hunting ground had been activated. Next, he opened the info on his tamed creatures. The limit was 100, and so far he had 24, including a hybrid. Intrigued, Park quickly concluded that the hybrid had to be Biku. A new group of orcs was approaching, and the interface suggested setting a summon command. The orcs charged in, weapons ready, eager to kill. But Park, as if oblivious to the threat, was just thinking about what to say to summon them. He extended his hand toward the orcs. A bluish glow appeared, and he declared, "Summon beasts!" Lightning and lights filled the field, and even with all that, the orcs advanced, grinning with sharp teeth. From within the blue light, a wolf's jaw appeared, revealing teeth ready for battle. One by one, the wolves emerged on the field, bringing a satisfied smile to Park's face. The whole pack ran at the orcs while a dove flew overhead, watching the battle. Soon after, Park joined the fight, holding a dagger. With a grin, he said that day was perfect to fill up all 100 slots. Meanwhile, music blasted in a club. Young people danced excitedly, but the director complained that the vibe was a bit dull, and asked for pretty girls to be brought in. At that moment, his phone rang. It was the manager again. He answered reluctantly, but widened his eyes when he heard that Park had already returned from the dungeon. He thought the manager was drunk. How could someone come back from a dungeon in just 2 hours? The surprise only grew when he learned that Park had gone back in again. The manager explained that, according to a vendor, this was the second time it had happened, and apparently Park was clearing level 5 dungeons in just 2 hours. The director found that hard to believe and said the manager must be hallucinating. Meanwhile, Song-yi, who was looking at her tablet, was startled when she heard her name suddenly. Meanwhile, Park kept having fun inside the dungeon, turning orcs into minced meat. When he turned around, he saw a rain of arrows flying straight at the wolves. Without hesitation, he gave the retreat command, and one by one, the wolves leaped into blue portals that opened up on the battlefield. A rain of arrows fell on the orcs, who tried to shield themselves, screaming in pain. Meanwhile, the protagonist propelled himself upward, and 2 white wings spread from his back. The orcs yelled in their own language as Park flew toward the group of enemy archers. He circled above the orcs and, as he descended, activated his tornado skill. Shimmering whirlwinds formed, lifting the monsters off the ground and spinning them violently. Suddenly, something caught his attention. He looked to the side and saw a massive creature falling from the sky. Park ran toward the spot where the monster would land while the tornado still spun the other enemies. He got there just as the Orc King landed. Without hesitation, he said it was time for the Grey Wolves to join the fight and summoned one of his wolves. In an instant, our hero transformed into a gigantic white wolf ready for battle. The orc grunted something in its language, but Park, now in wolf form, replied, "I don't understand a word you're saying," and slammed a punch into the monster's face. The Orc King was thrown backward. Right after, Park activated the tornado again, and a blast of wind swallowed the monster up. Still in wolf form, our hero leapt into the air and chased the orc mid-flight. With a spinning strike, he hit the Orc King squarely, sending the creature plummeting at insane speed, creating a huge crater in the ground. Park landed on top of him and finished him off with the final blow. A notification popped up. He had leveled up and gained 238 experience points. A portal opened 500 meters away and would close in 15 minutes. Without wasting time, Park ran while the orcs began to recover from the windstorm. He passed through a wolf pack and activated the tame ability. The orcs, now aware, ran after him, but Park, with his new wolves, was already charging toward the portal. One by one, the wolves jumped into smaller portals he summoned. Back in human form, he crossed the portal and thought about how the side effects of this transformation were very different from when he turned into a hybrid. Opening the menu, he saw he had tamed 88 wolves. He thought that with one more run, he could fill all 100 slots and still raise the hunting level. That's when a girl in a cap appeared in front of him. It was Song-yi. She asked if he was Park, and he, surprised, asked what she wanted. People nearby recognized Song-yi and started whispering if the two were together. Rumors of a romance spread while the manager called the director to say they had finally met. The director, excited, asked if this meant they'd finally capture Park. The manager replied that Song-yi was making progress, and that he was responding well to her moves. The director laughed, saying that in the end, Park was just a man. Song-yi grabbed the protagonist's arm and the manager, thrilled, said they were heading to a cafe. The director replied that he expected nothing less from her and told them to keep an eye on things. In the car, he ordered the driver to step on it. Meanwhile, Park seemed busier than usual. The director finally arrived at the location and, confused, asked where he was. Song-yi was sitting at a table, crying and sobbing. She said she'd come there with him. Park had just commented that he wanted a drink and left right after. The director shouted, incredulous, wanting to know how that was possible while Song-yi sobbed even harder. Suddenly, Song-yi screamed that Park rejected her because she was weak, that he didn't like people like that. But the director misunderstood and asked if she was using illegal substances. Furious, she stood up, slammed her hands on the table and shouted, "Of course not!" Then she turned, stormed out, and as she left, she promised that she'd become a hunter too. The director, clueless, asked the manager what was going on. The manager explained that Park had said his girlfriend needed to be strong. The director started to panic, saying everything was falling apart. The manager tried to calm him down, saying there were strong, awakened women in the clan. The director asked who he was talking about. The manager replied that there was a redhead, Class A, very powerful. But the director got angry and asked where he came up with ideas like that, demanding to know where Park was right then. The manager said he had gone back into the portal. Desperate, the director put his hands on his head, complaining that nothing ever went as planned. But suddenly, the manager pointed behind him. Park had already come out of the portal. Our hero stood there checking something in the interface only he could see. With a slight smile on his face, Park looked out at the horizon. The director, in shock, said he couldn't believe it. It had only been a few minutes. Then he ran toward Park, determined. This time, he wouldn't let him escape. The man ran as fast as he could, shouting Park's name. When he finally caught up, our hero asked straight to the point what they wanted. The director said he needed to talk. He slipped his hand into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, trying to introduce himself formally, but Park didn't even care. He just stepped through the portal without saying a single word. The director, confused, asked if he'd really just been ignored like that, so bluntly. The manager confirmed that, apparently, yes. Furious, the director started cursing Park and was about to chase after him through the portal, but the manager stopped him. Still fuming, he asked if he had really seen that happen. The manager tried to calm him down, and that's when someone approached. A voice cut through the tension saying, "Enough." The director, irritated, demanded to know who it was. A man appeared, surrounded by bodyguards in black suits. Instantly, the director recognized Chief Secretary Cheon. Cheon said there were too many eyes around and suggested they drop the matter for now. Around them, a small crowd began whispering. One murmured, "That's the president's son, right?" Another mocked, "He's like that because Park ignored him." Someone else laughed, "I'm curious to see what he'll mess up this time." The director, feeling his image crumble, thought things were really starting to fall apart. He grumbled that today just wasn't his day. Cheon then suggested he rest and leave the rest to him. Still annoyed, the director said coldly that this matter was his responsibility. But Cheon praised his effort and said there would be another chance to get close to Park. With a glimmer of hope, the director asked if that was true. The secretary confirmed it firmly. Then, frustrated, the director said goodbye and muttered that he was tired of this crazy guy. Right after, Cheon called the president, saying he was waiting at the dungeon entrance. The president asked if his son, John Ho, had messed up again, but Cheon replied that the most important thing was Park's ability to clear dungeons, something that exceeded all expectations. The president, pleased, said that was why they were investing so much money in him. At that exact moment, Park came out of the dungeon once again, catching Cheon off guard while he was still on the phone. Without even looking around, Park opened his interface and began analyzing the data. He had finally tamed 100 creatures, and now, at the second hunting level, the limit had increased to 200. With everything reviewed, he mapped out his next plan: to rest and eat. Meanwhile, he didn't even notice there were people right in front of him. Cheon greeted him, and Park replied sarcastically that he was really popular today. The secretary introduced himself as a member of DGB, and Park commented that it seemed like that guild managed this dungeon. Cheon confirmed and explained that he was there to apologize for a certain incident. Park didn't get it at first and asked what he meant, but then it clicked. They were talking about when he went into the level 5 dungeon. Park asked why they were only apologizing now, and Cheon replied that they were preparing something more than just words. They also wanted to thank him. Park's presence had massively increased the value of the dungeons. People nearby whispered, curious, about who that guy talking to Cheon was. The secretary then said they had something prepared for him, but suggested they continue the conversation at a restaurant. Park, hungry, immediately agreed and said he'd love to eat. Cheon said the cars were ready, and Park commented that they had good taste. The secretary asked if he liked them, and our hero just smiled. Back at Suho's guild, the night was magical. The main tree had grown even taller, and fireflies danced through the air. The group returned home, celebrating the great day. Good drinks, juicy lobster, a real feast. Jang remarked that he could understand Monk's state, but felt bad for Junho, who didn't even get to drink. Han laughed and said it would be great to hire a driver, and everyone immediately agreed. Suddenly, Han's expression changed. He cursed loudly and Junho asked what had happened. He said he should have set up a meeting with people interested in joining the guild, but he forgot because of the food and drinks. Monk mentioned he needed to stop by the construction office the next day and, a bit worried, suggested they reschedule the meeting. But Han, excited, said this would become routine. "We'll do it every day. Eat and drink lobster." He opened the chat and said it was full of messages, all complaining. He looked at Junho and asked if he should handle recruitment himself. Junho replied that actually it was his job anyway since he didn't even have a license yet and was still registered in the guild as the doorman. Junho was in shock, and Monk commented that before anything else he needed to get his license. Junho replied that the next day he could finally start the process. Jang meanwhile warned them that tough times were coming. After all, they still needed to join many more raids. Chell apologized to the guys, but Han said that Park would surely come up with a solution. Monk added that the guild leader would know how to handle this kind of problem. Suddenly, Gunwoo came running to meet the guys and jumped straight into his father's arms, while Grandma, watching from upstairs, saw everyone arriving. Junho hugged his son with pure joy, and Han was thrilled to see the old lady, who was carrying a box full of lobsters in her hands. Grandma asked where they had all been this whole time. They said they'd been working and then stopped for a quick drink. Oh, and of course they brought lobsters as a gift. Park, with a full belly, put his hands on his stomach and said, "Now that was amazing." The secretary was happy to see him satisfied. Our hero then asked, "All that, with the expensive dishes and the modified SUVs, wasn't it over the top?" But Chandler answered firmly, "When someone risks their life like Park did, there's no such thing as too much. And there was more. There were still other gifts." Meanwhile, in an isolated area outside the city, muffled screams echoed from inside red containers marked DSS. Someone, with their mouth full of blood, screamed for them to just kill him already. Park, a bit suspicious, asked if this whole apology was just an excuse to throw a party. Cheon laughed and said he had a great sense of humor, but then the mood turned serious. Park asked what they really wanted. Cheon, serious now too, revealed they wanted an official partnership with Park's guild. He explained that the city was divided into 12 sectors, but the DGB company didn't own a sector of its own yet, all because they didn't have a level 6 combat team. Even with all their resources, they simply couldn't form one. Park remarked that must be a blow to their pride. The secretary agreed, especially for the company's CEO. Our hero was direct and said he wasn't interested in representing any sector, but Cheon quickly clarified. The proposal wasn't to join a sector, but to create a 13th sector, together with Park's guild. Cheon explained that today's sectors are formed around level 6 guilds, but those guilds are already overloaded. The residents are afraid, but if a 13th sector appeared where nothing threatened them, everyone would want to move there. Property values would skyrocket, and they believed that Park Suho's guild could become the symbol of that hope. He also asked if the guild had faced difficulties. The answer was clear. They lacked capital, manpower, experience, but if Park kept focusing on the dungeons, they would handle the rest, from management to government support. Park replied that they actually had capital and experience, but what they lacked was strength. Even so, Cheon insisted he saw potential in the guild and asked if his companions would be ready for this challenge. Our boy thought about his friends and felt uncertain. Cheon then threw out another provocation. Why do big guilds always get support from companies and not the government? He said that DGB wouldn't find a better partner. Park reflected. That would mean they'd have total control over the dungeons. And honestly, it sounded really good, but he was honest and said he'd think about it carefully. After all, a new sector isn't built overnight. Cheon, surprised, still thanked him. He thought people said Park was just a goofy glutton who melted at the sight of gifts. Maybe the gifts hadn't been good enough. Park then stood up, saying he needed to go. Cheon stopped him. He was forgetting one more gift. The secretary said it had been really hard to find him. Park, curious, asked who they were talking about. Cheon revealed that after being put on the wanted list, the ex-director of the debt company had fled and gone into hiding, but the company's agents managed to track him down, and now he was in Park's hands, officially declared dead during capture. Surprised, our hero said that man had caused a lot of harm, and honestly, he asked Cheon to handle him however he thought best. The secretary looked awkward about the answer, and Park explained, that guy's days were already numbered. Why waste time on him? Cheon asked if he really didn't want to see him after everything, but Park replied that it was too much, even for him. He even suggested throwing the guy back into the dungeon. Suddenly, Park had an idea and asked them to wait. Meanwhile, Junho was getting smothered with hugs from his son, who showed off all the moves he'd learned at school, until his phone rang. He picked up. It was his brother. After hearing what Park had to say, Junho asked, surprised, "Seriously? Now?" And Park confirmed, it was right now. Junho wanted to know what it was about, and was even more surprised when he heard there was someone who wanted to meet him. Park said he'd send the address by message. When he mentioned the name DGB, Junho looked confused and asked what that was. In his car, the protagonist said he was heading out. His final comment was that he'd leave things for his little brother to handle. The secretary nodded, saying they were ready if Park needed anything. Even late at night, all the windows in the DGB building were lit up. The president called Miso's boss and asked if he was still at the office. The man replied yes and wanted to know why he was calling. The president said they'd managed to meet Park and everything went well, thanking him for that. But he shot back that there was no need to thank him. He just wanted a return on his investment, since soon everyone would start moving to Park's lands. He also mentioned they'd have to rebuild all the infrastructure and housing complexes urgently. The boss replied that it was exactly in moments like this that everyone should help each other. Meanwhile, Junho arrived at the given location and was met by two men. Just to be sure, they confirmed his name before leading him to a container. Inside the container, a man was screaming and cursing, demanding food and threatening to kill everyone once he got out. That must be the guy the DGB soldiers captured, the one I said died naturally. Suddenly, the door opened slightly, and his tone changed. He said that wasn't what he meant, apologized, and claimed he was just very hungry. Junho stepped into the container, and the man froze. surprised. He recognized Junho, a wicked smile spreading across his face. The young man just responded with a quiet, "The man wanted to know what Junho was doing there, and he replied that he'd been told someone wanted to see him. The man said he hadn't changed at all and asked if Park came too. When he heard no, he smiled with satisfaction. Junho asked what he wanted, and the man said seriously that he wanted to apologize. He said that the day he attacked him, it was only because he lost control after Junho's friend beat the others. He said he regretted it. Junho replied that he understood, that it was in the past now. The man thanked him and brought up another topic, the 5th level dungeon incident. He insisted he wasn't the one who sent the guy in there. Seeing the suspicion in Junho's eyes, the man asked if he really thought a mere debt collector would have the power to do something like that. He said it was all the government and DGB who wanted to use Park for their own interests. He claimed he was just the scapegoat. Junho stayed silent, listening, until he said that must have been really hard on him. The man confirmed. He said his business was destroyed. He'd been hiding in abandoned places full of goblins, and he thought he'd die there. Junho replied that it was a sad situation, but if that was all, he'd leave. The man, afraid, begged. He wanted help to get out of there. He claimed he'd given him money, helped Gunwoo's mom get a job, but then he paused, realizing what he'd just said. With his head down, he admitted the woman had asked him not to tell Junho. Junho's calm look turned to shock and confusion. He asked directly, "What kind of job was that?" The man explained that, for a long time, he worked as a manager at an employment center, and Gunwoo's mom came to him begging for help to get work. He then remembered the past, the day they stormed into Junho's apartment and found only the woman holding her baby. The man asked where Junho had been. He said the debt kept piling up and had grown huge. It was pathetic because the family was suffering over a single mistake. The woman cried, trembling, begging not to be killed. The man held her face and said he could never kill such a beautiful woman. He asked if that man was worth all that suffering. He asked if they even had enough to eat. Then he offered to help her. A hard-working woman like her could pay off the debt in just 3 months. But the woman turned her face, pleading through tears for him not to do that. Even so, he pulled out a wad of cash, asked if she wasn't tired of living like that, and said that nowadays, a woman's life can change in the blink of an eye. He left the money inside a paper with a phone number and told her to call when she was ready. As he left, he said that if her husband wasn't there next time, she'd have to pay. The woman looked at the door closing, her eyes full of fear and tears streaming down her face. After hearing all that, Junho was stunned and exclaimed, "She went to your office after that?" The man explained that when Junho disappeared, Gunwoo's mother showed up desperate with the boy in her arms, begging for help to find a job. Junho could barely say a word, but the pain in his eyes said it all. He remembered the day he came home and found his son crying, and only a note. On that paper, she'd written that she was tired of living that life by his side and asked never to be looked for again. Clenching his teeth, Junho asked if the man knew where she was now. He answered that if he was freed, he'd show him where she was living. Junho's heart pounded in his chest, but looking at that beaten man, he had already made his decision. Meanwhile, Park was driving when he got a message from Miso, saying that Dr. Toddler was finally available for a meeting in England. Our hero got excited. "Finally," he replied. He remembered Miso's story about how the power meter and the blood crystal generator had sparked a new era of discovery. Park hoped the doctor could figure out where that dimensional rift came from, which planet he'd ended up on, and maybe if it could lead him to his brothers. Excited by the thought, he tried to call and share the news, but it went straight to voicemail. The phone was off. Without a second thought, he turned to the driver and said they needed to change course. When the man asked where to, Park answered that they needed to go back to the DGB container. Meanwhile, the blue SUV was already driving away, and the scar-faced man was yelling curses, telling everyone to go to hell. Then he turned to Junho and said thanks, to which the young man replied sarcastically, "You're welcome." The car kept rolling through the night streets until it stopped at the address the man had given. Junho told him they'd arrived. The guy stretched, said he'd had a good nap, and even complimented the car. With a sly look, he said Junho was doing well for himself, but the young man ignored the comment and got straight to the point. He wanted to know where Gunwoo's mother was. The man said his guys would show up soon to take him to her, and at that exact moment, a group started approaching. The scar-faced man leaned out the car window and greeted the thugs. The gangsters gathered around the car. They recognized him immediately. One of them exclaimed, "It's Boss Yongari!" and another was shocked he was still alive. A third joked that they'd already counted him as dead. When one of the guys peeked inside and saw Junho, he wanted to know who the kid was. Another gang member recognized him and asked, "Isn't that Junho?" The name spread through the crowd. Everyone knew it. They started mocking him. "Isn't that loser Park Junho? Whoa, nice big car." Yongari then said he was helping the kid find his wife, and asked for their cooperation. One of the thugs peeked again and said that if he was looking for the woman, she was probably called Mi-gyung. He said she was inside the building. Junho was guided to the entrance, surrounded by a mob armed with axes and baseball bats. One of the thugs shoved him from behind, asking what he was so afraid of. Almost stumbling, Junho stepped into the building. Someone behind him laughed, saying he was dying to see his wife. They told someone to turn on the lights, and the room was flooded with bright light, temporarily blinding Junho. When his eyes adjusted, what he saw was a massive grinder, covered in dried blood. Frowning, Junho stared at the place. Yongari commented that this building used to be a crushing factory. One of the gangsters suggested Mi-gyung could be in the second part of the warehouse, but another said there were already over 200 bodies inside, and he didn't even remember anymore. Junho turned, confused, trying to ask where Gunwoo's mother was. But before he could say anything, he was struck on the head with a bat. He hit the ground hard. Blood dripped down his face. The scar-faced man let out a cruel laugh and said Junho was too stupid to get it. "We killed her." He claimed they had helped Mi-gyung, but she didn't repay them. He called her ungrateful. He said if she hadn't been so stupid, she might have survived. In the end, they were doing Junho a favor. Trying to get up, Junho heard, "Your woman doesn't matter anymore." And then the kicks began. The scar-faced man poured out all his rage, shouting that it was all Junho's fault and his brothers. They had destroyed his business. Another thug told him to calm down, saying if he killed him now, there'd be no fun. But the guy wouldn't stop yelling, consumed by hatred. "It's all because of you. How am I gonna kill those bastards?" With an insane grin on his face, the man looked down at Junho, now unconscious on the ground, and asked, "Do you know how long I've dreamed about this?" Junho coughed, still breathing, and the mocking answer came, "This bastard's tough, huh?" Someone suggested splashing water on Junho when he passed out, but even lying there, he was thinking he'd kill them all. It felt like going back to his childhood, when he used to say the same thing while playing video games. Back then, he thought his problems would end once school was over, but now, as an adult, there he was, playing again, and while he played, he wished the manager would die. In his favorite games, the protagonist was a maniac who slaughtered his victims, and Junho saw himself in those roles. It was the only way to escape the miserable life he lived. The only place he felt free was in the virtual world. The only one who treated him kindly was Mi-gyung. She was the one brave enough to ask him out for the first time. But even after their son was born, the habit stayed the same. Junho would vent his anger on violent games while his wife and child slept in the next room. In his head, he was worthless, dead weight, a man who tortured his wife with constant outbursts. Suddenly, one of the thugs turned on the grinder and shouted that everything was ready. The scar-faced man ordered Junho to get up. He said he was tired of beating him, and that soon he'd see his wife again. And Junho, head down, thought, if he really saw her again, if she was still alive, he'd beg for a second chance. But the man wasn't thinking about any reunion. He said they'd do to Junho the same thing they did to the girl, break his knees and toss his body, piece by piece, into the grinder. He pointed to a thug with a sledgehammer and gave the order, "Go ahead." The sledgehammer was raised. The thug told him to grit his teeth and because it would hurt. Junho replied in a whisper, "Thank you. Now I remembered the past." He admitted he was a bastard who deserved to suffer, but strangely enough, the blows didn't hurt anymore. The thug yelled that he was completely insane and swung the sledgehammer with all his strength. But in the blink of an eye, Junho stood up and sliced off the thug's hands, precisely and silently. Blood sprayed and the scream echoed through the warehouse. Right then, daggers began to take shape in Junho's hands. The thugs froze in horror, and then he said, "When Gunwoo's mom left me, I promised I'd never do this again." But now, it was too late. With a sinister smile, he warned, no one would leave that place alive. The thugs started screaming in panic. They pointed at the blood-soaked blades in Junho's hands and shouted that he had awakened. They tried to run, but it was useless. Junho went after them effortlessly, cutting them down one by one with brutal precision. Yongari watched, stunned, unable to believe what he was seeing. Junho's grin grew wider with each strike. Each thug he took down made his expression even more twisted. The survivors fled the building screaming, and a head was tossed out with them. Junho stepped out right after, walking through the door with his daggers still dripping. The thugs begged to escape, but he was already closing in on another one, way too fast. Up above, where the snipers should have been, Park himself was watching everything with a faint smile. A man dressed in black beside him asked if his brother was okay. Park said yes and told him to make sure Junho wouldn't have any legal problems after this. The man replied that most of those thugs were labeled negative social value, so the government wouldn't care. Meanwhile, Junho had no idea his brother was there. He kept up the slaughter like nothing else existed. Park, still smiling, watched and said that now he had truly awakened. that he could handle everything on his own now. The smile on Junho's face wasn't anger anymore. It was the smile of someone who had overcome his regrets and evolved. The long night passed. The next day, on the news, the reporter said that despite many dungeon breakouts in the city, the situation was starting to improve thanks to the actions of the special military forces. Even so, many believed the guilds couldn't keep up with the growing number of portals. But for now, the residents could hear the sound of victory and the soldiers celebrating. The cameras showed the elite 707 unit, and among them, our blonde girl Choi. The live footage showed Choi walking with a group, alongside a red-haired girl. Miso, watching the scene, muttered, calling Choi an idiot for not calling her. Then the broadcast cut to a scandal involving Songyi, who had just released a new song. On screen, a photo showed Songyi talking with Park, and the anchor asked, "Did you see this guy?" Choi passed by just then and stopped to watch. Beside her, the red-haired girl looked at the image and burst out in rage, calling Park a son of a bitch dog. At that moment, the captain of another group stepped out of a portal, swearing under his breath. One of the soldiers reported that they had sent 12 teams to that location, and they all brought back more resources. But the treasure they were looking for hadn't been found. Miso, watching silently, drifted into old memories. She thought about Park's words when he said they just needed to train for 1,000 years. And then she remembered something the white-mustached man had said in a meeting, that Park simply didn't want to reveal his secret to anyone. That's when Choi exploded and yelled, "Park's not like that!" After gathering all that information, Miso came to the conclusion that she needed to stop focusing so much on dungeons and start paying more attention to what Park was actually doing with all of it. At that moment, the girl's phone rang. It was Park himself, and she answered by asking if there was any chance they'd find his brother. But he said everything was fine, and asked a completely different question. What happens to an awakened when they're bitten by a zombie? Miso's expression changed immediately. Worried, she shot back. Did someone get bitten? Far away, Monk was lying in his room, groaning in pain, with his bitten leg throbbing. Blood dripped from the wound, and a reddish web was starting to spread under his skin. But Park, pretending everything was normal, replied, "Nobody got bitten. I was just curious." Monk writhed, clutching his leg, but it didn't help at all. Trying to stay calm, Miso explained that so far, there were only 38 recorded cases of awakened people bitten by a zombie. She went on day 48, 2 of them died of leukemia. 26 lost all their hair. In 7 cases, it was just pain at the bite site, no other symptoms. And then came the scary part. But 3 rank F awakened turned into zombies. She explained that the symptoms usually include fever, phantom pain, and red veins. She added, the lower the rank, the higher the chance of transforming. Park asked what should be done after the bite, if they needed to go into quarantine. Miso said that in specialized facilities, infected people were monitored constantly, while scientists worked on developing a vaccine. Park hung up, but he wasn't convinced. In his mind, it all sounded like just another experiment on human guinea pigs. Walking through the streets, Park saw a man selling stuff right on the ground. His face was covered by a hood, and he was scribbling strange symbols on pieces of paper. The MC walked up and greeted him. The man replied, "Long time no see. Still want medicine for your brother?" But Park shook his head. "Not this time. My friend got bitten by a zombie. Do you have anything that could help?" The man started rummaging through jars until he found one in particular. He handed over the jar and said it would help against any bite. The name of the ointment was Anti-Frame. Use it twice a day, morning and night. In a week, it'll start working. Park asked the price. The man smiled and said, "Since this is your second time, I'll give you a discount. It costs 4 million, but I'll sell it for 2. Park didn't hesitate. Better get some backup. Sell me 10 jars? The seller happily agreed. And before leaving, he gave one last piece of advice. If the infected starts convulsing, give him a hard slap. Sometimes that stops the infection. Right after that, Park walked away with the jars in his backpack. Behind him, 2 police officers showed up yelling that it was illegal to sell things there. The vendor didn't think twice. He packed everything up in a second and dashed down the street. The cops ran to the edge and looked down but didn't see anyone. Suddenly, a large black bird flew off, leaving them confused. Meanwhile, Monk kept writhing in bed. Outside his room, Han, Jang, and Gunwoo were in a panic because Park hadn't arrived yet. Gunwoo, nervous, looked inside and asked, "Is he turning into a zombie?" Han took a deep breath and replied, "Yeah." Right after, Han pulled out his phone and showed something on the screen. It was a button. "What's that?" asked Jiang. Gunwoo explained, "It's the ultimate weapon. If I press it, Monk dies." Before they could stop him, the kid pressed the button. But instead of an explosion, a super bright flashlight flickered on. Han stared in confusion. Jiang froze. And Gunwoo, disappointed, mumbled, I thought 100 spears would shoot out of the phone." In a last dramatic move, the boy stretched out his hands like he was casting a spell and shouted, "Come back to normal. Don't turn into a zombie." At that moment, from downstairs, Grandma yelled, "Everyone to the table! The soup's getting cold!" And as if by miracle, Monk, who had been passed out, sat up in bed, holding his head. Gunwoo pointed and screamed, "He's up!" Jang, in shock, asked, "Did he really turn into a monster?" Han answered that, honestly, Monk probably just wanted something to eat. Suddenly, a voice came from behind them, asking what they were doing there. They all turned at once. Standing at the door was Park, holding a green jar. The guy scrambled over, shocked at Monk's condition. The red veins had already reached his eyes. That's when Park gave him a precise smack on the head. Cut to the reporter. Live from the city where the level 7 dungeon had just been cleared. The whole world was watching that place. 10 days and 11 hours had passed since Hero's group of 10 went into that dungeon. On the streets, a huge crowd had gathered, hope shining in their eyes, praying the team would return safely. And then, a silhouette appeared in the portal, and the crowd erupted with joy. Cries of "They're back!" echoed everywhere. Hero's name was shouted with emotion. The reporter announced that Hero's fire team had come out of the dungeon and that the world needed to know this mission had been a success. People clapped and cheered. But suddenly, Hero's teammates started collapsing one by one. Medics rushed to help them. Then, Hero himself fell to his knees. The reporter, shocked, asked if the battle had been that exhausting. The boy fell unconscious to the ground, and she announced in disbelief that 7 of the team members hadn't made it out alive. After the dungeon, Hero was taken to the best hospital in the country. Akiko was by his side, watching over him as he slept. When he opened his eyes and saw her, he called her name, and the girl was surprised he'd woken up. He held his head and asked for water. After drinking, he let out a heavy sigh. The girl blamed him for everything, but he said it wasn't her fault, and he thought, bitterly, that in truth, it wasn't his either. Akiko then said they'd found out about Park meeting with Daigo, which was highly suspicious. The boy was shocked. After all, Daigo was the deputy director of the Supernatural Department, in charge of all national security. Getting the attention of someone like that was worth more than any recognition from the Awakened Federation. It meant Park was now on their radar. Hero, furious, thought Park was a bastard, because the one who should lead humanity toward a bright future was him, not Park. He decided he couldn't ignore him anymore. He had lost 7 people in that dungeon, but even that didn't faze him anymore. He'd already lost so many companions over time, so many deaths, so many reincarnations. Even Akiko had died dozens of times. He realized that his rage had a name, Park. He couldn't let a lunatic ruin the plan. From his actions, it was obvious Park was up to something dark. So, Hero concluded that, for the good of humanity, Park had to die. Hero asked Akiko to find any boat that could get him to Busan, or build one with her own hands. Just find a way to get him there. Meanwhile, on a sunny morning at Park's guild, sunlight streamed through the leaves of a giant tree. Junho woke up with a splitting headache. Grandma scolded him, saying that's why he shouldn't drink so much, and told him to come down for breakfast. He grabbed his ID badge from the table and smiled, thinking, now I'm a real mercenary. Meanwhile, Han was already in his room in front of his laptop, handling the business side of things. He thought that after people found out Park was just an Awakened, their views dropped a bit. But even so, the channel had 1 million subscribers and over 10 million views, something he'd never imagined reaching. Like they say, success is all about connections. Earning the trust of someone powerful is a skill too, he thought. At that moment, Junho burst through the door, nearly giving Han a heart attack. Smiling, Junho asked if Han was the only one having fun there. Furious, the boy snapped back, asking if he'd ever learned to knock. Junho apologized, saying Grandma was calling him down to eat. He also asked where Jang was. Han answered that he was training, as always, and that he'd only come down after he was done. Jang was at the training field, surrounded by tree stumps. Eyes closed, he listened to the wind. Suddenly he opened his eyes and began slicing through the trees with skill, one technique after another. With a final strike, he felled the last one, but he wasn't satisfied. The trees regenerated in the field, and he muttered that he couldn't hesitate in combat anymore. He repeated the attacks over and over, swearing that he'd never let that happen again. Meanwhile, Park and the guys decided to head out hunting with a pack of wolves. One of the boys shouted, "Whoever catches the deer first wins!" And another added, "The loser has to pick apples!" Park stood in front of the temple, facing the older monk and 2 boys in gray robes. Our boy commented that the temple was finally ready and asked if there was any risk of it collapsing. The monk just laughed and assured him that everything there had been built perfectly. Park said that if there was ever a problem, they shouldn't hesitate to tell him. The monk then thanked Park deeply for his help. They said they didn't even know how to repay such generosity for being given shelter. Meanwhile, a deer ran by with a whole pack of wolves chasing after it. Gunwoo was leading the race, excitedly yelling for everyone to run faster. The temple boys followed along, hyping up the wolves to go all out. Park watched it all with a smile on his face, saying it was the first time he'd ever seen Gunwoo so happy. After all, he used to be so lonely. So many mothers wouldn't even let their kids play with him, and he heard it all. A woman from the temple called out that lunch was ready and invited Park, but he declined that day. Curious, he asked if Monk was getting better. The other monk said that he'd had delusions before but could already train now, and he was even eating well again. Monk, now in front of the mirror, looked at the scar around his red eye. Now he was like Saitama with a Sharingan, and his mind drifted back to the past. He remembered the teasing when they called him a hairless monkey. An orphan since childhood, he was bullied by the other boys until he shut himself off from the world. Then his master took him in and brought him to the temple. Many years later, goblins invaded and destroyed everything. They killed his master right before his eyes. Monk told Park that it was that day he started killing. He hunted the goblins down in a rage, one by one, with no mercy. He searched every hidden corner to exterminate them all. He said he'd committed that sin by his own will, and he didn't care what would happen to his soul afterward. He just wanted to silence the burning anger inside him. During that frenzy, he heard voices, or maybe it was just him talking to his future self. The voice said that if he really cared, he'd have died in that dungeon a long time ago. Monk looked at Park and thanked him. He said he had saved him again, helping restore the temple and bringing peace back to his heart. But then, suddenly serious, he said he now had a new goal. Park and the others listened, not understanding what he meant. Then Monk summoned a winged spear right there inside, destroying everything around him. The boys stepped back, startled. With a sinister smile, Monk declared that for the sake of the wronged, he'd face hell in their place. Jang looked confused, and Han muttered that now they had two maniacs in the group. Right then, Grandma came charging up the stairs with a knife in her hand, yelling to know who the idiot was that dared to draw a weapon inside her house. Monk didn't wait. He dove right out the window, breaking everything in his way. Minutes before all that, he'd been in his room, staring at his reflection. When they called him for lunch, he headbutted the mirror and smiled like a maniac. "I'm so damn handsome." Meanwhile, the full moon lit up the sea, leaving a silver trail on the waves. A small ship sailed quickly. Hiro and Akiko were at the stern. When they reached the shore, Akiko said they'd continue by car from there. The hero, silent, just stared at the horizon, telling himself he was following the druid. Back at Park's guild, people wondered if Monk had come back yet. Someone said he'd gotten an earful from the old lady, and another replied that was the least he deserved after breaking the window. Junho came in, saying the secretary had called. The city plan was ready. The next day, they'd receive the map and start working out the construction details. Park told Junho to keep an eye on them. No shady business allowed there. As he chewed on breakfast, Zhang curiously asked where Park was heading. Our protagonist said he was going to England to meet Dr. Toddler. Han said that would be impossible for now. Park asked why, and the boy explained. All flights and sea routes had been cancelled. Surprised, Park wanted to know what had happened. Zhang answered, a series of dungeon breaks had started. The sky was overrun with wyverns and the seas with another creature. Tense, Park asked for more details. Han showed him a news report about the wyverns. Then another piece covered a giant octopus, and they didn't even know where it was now. Junyo asked thoughtfully if Park couldn't just fly there himself. Our hero replied that he probably could, if he turned into a pigeon, but he'd only managed to fly for about 10 minutes. And then Junho jumped in right away. Yeah, that's not even enough to get to the corner, let alone England. Park let out a heavy sigh. He never thought he'd one day wish so badly for a decent pair of wings. Then he asked how long he'd have to wait. Zhang answered that the country's army was already working to wipe out the creatures, but it would take at least a month to fix everything. Park was stunned by how long it'd take, but Han came up with a crazy, yet possible, idea. He said there was another way to get to England, by using a golden eagle, but not just any golden eagle. It had to be an awakened golden eagle. Park's eyes went wide, and he asked where on earth he was supposed to find one of those. Han said it might be possible to find one in a restricted area up north, where a survival channel showed a guy living in the wild. In one of the videos, they caught footage of several giant awakened animals, and among them, a golden eagle. Not long after, the blue SUV was already speeding down the road. Someone inside the car let out a frustrated, "Damn it!" Park commented that he was chilling, doing nothing, and Han, almost crying, replied that he was going blind from managing the channel so much. Our hero laughed and said he should be happy then, but Han shot back that if they filmed something good out there, he'd have even more work to do. Akiko was driving and suggested that Hiro take a nap. After all, they still had 10 hours of travel ahead, but he refused. The girl said that if anyone found out what they were doing, there'd be a huge scandal. Hiro knew that, and he also knew it could spark an interethnic conflict. When she asked why they didn't try to settle it through official channels, he answered, "No time for bureaucracy. It's easier to handle it ourselves." The GPS announced that 200 meters ahead was the start of the zombie zone, and Akiko said they'd have to cut through it. Meanwhile, Park and Han had already stopped their car and gotten out. Right in front of them, a massive beast was snorting steam through its nostrils, baring sharp teeth and a savage grin. A colossal boar stared Han down, clearly pissed. Park's voice echoed in his head, asking how he felt. Terrified, the boy replied that the thing looked way too strong, and that it really didn't like humans. Our hero loved that answer. He said he needed to tame that creature. Suddenly, the boar charged forward and Han ran for his life, scrambling up the nearest tree. The boar slammed its head into the trunk so hard the tree started to tip. Han screamed for help, and with the second hit, the tree gave way completely. He crashed onto his back, eyes shut tight, begging for help, until he felt something touch his face. When he opened his eyes, he found himself face to face with a giant rabbit with glowing red eyes. Panicked, he started crawling backward, glancing at the boar and Park just standing there. Confused about why the animals weren't attacking, he asked if they weren't planning to eat him. Park answered that it didn't look like it. Relieved, Han lowered his head and let out a shaky breath. He pointed at the rabbit and asked our hero to get that thing away from him because it was terrifying, and its level was insane. Rank C, level 2. At that moment, a blue portal appeared and the rabbit hopped right in. Seeing that, Han asked why the boar hadn't done the same. Park climbed onto the beast's back and said it would carry them instead. He'd even given it a name already, Yucca. While Park rode Yucca, Han sat on top of a wolf and asked if those transformations were really worth it. Park explained they only changed the animals' personalities a little. Still skeptical, Han said it seemed like more than just a little, but Park clarified that he only transformed beasts weaker than him. Curious, Han wanted to know if the rabbit was really that scary. Park confirmed, saying the thing had a higher rank than him. The boy grumbled that even a rabbit was stronger than he was. Even though they'd already found two powerful animals, there was still no sign of the eagle. Han asked how much longer they'd stay out there. They reached a lookout point with a view over the entire forest. Park commented that the eagle was by far the hardest to find. The protagonist then called Miso, who immediately answered, asking how she could help. Park wanted to know where Blondie was, since he couldn't reach her. Miso replied that she was in another region and asked if he wanted her to connect them. Meanwhile, heavy clouds gathered over a ruined city. A soldier shouted to the captain that they had 10 minutes before the dungeon broke. Choi, dead serious, ordered an immediate withdrawal. The soldiers had already called for an airstrike ages ago, so why hadn't anyone responded yet? Finally, they got the transmission. An airstrike was impossible, and the artillery was also out of operation. One of the soldiers, furious, cursed out loud and asked why they were only telling them this now. They were told that the third battle group would arrive in 10 minutes, and another one would come in 15. Choi, furious, asked if that was a joke, because until then, they'd have to hold off the spiders alone. The soldiers, ignoring the complaint, said the only thing that mattered now was to retreat. Choi, already losing his patience, ordered them to grab their gear and get out. Another soldier yelled that they'd better get out of there before the witch changed her mind. And the girl herself mocked the line, saying, "That's why nobody loves me." Right after, she answered the phone, introducing herself as the captain of the 11th Recon Squad. On the other end of the line, Park cheerfully said it had been a while since they'd heard from them. Blondie was surprised to hear Park's voice, and he fell silent for a few seconds before saying he needed to find the Golden Eagle and wanted to know if her group could help. She clenched her teeth hearing that, then suddenly yelled into the phone, "Screw you, you disgusting pervert!" and hung up right in his face. Park just stared at the phone, completely lost. He turned to Han and asked, "Seriously, how does asking for help to catch an eagle sound sexual?" But Han was already glued to what he saw ahead. He pointed and said, "What is that?" A column of black smoke was rising outside the city. Holding up his phone, Han said in disbelief, "They're starfish." Park's eyes widened. "Star what?" Han showed him a news report on his phone. The starfish dungeon had broken open. Those creatures spat fire and exploded when they died. Our hero was stunned that they caused problems even after death. Han, eyes wide, pointed upward. "Look at the birds." A whole flock was flying across the sky, fleeing the dungeon. And amazingly, Park seemed to enjoy the chaos, watching it all with a small grin. Han, seeing the fire spreading, warned, "This is moving too fast. Time to get out of here." But Park stood there, watching the fire close in. As the animals ran desperately through the forest, the flames started to catch up with the slower ones. Suddenly, the wolf Han was riding on began to howl. Park, eyes steady, said, "The fire starters are here." The fire was already devouring everything behind the animals, catching up to the fastest ones. Then the two of them looked up at the sky. Han shouted, "A golden eagle!" In the middle of the flock, a massive eagle soared, much bigger than the others. Park, amazed, said it looked incredible. He read the info, rank C, level 6. Smiling, he named the bird Suri and declared, "Now, he's going to fly with me." The news reported on the sudden fire that ended out of nowhere due to a natural disaster. Experts claimed that all the starfish were destroyed by a hurricane. Watching the piece, Han muttered, "What a load of crap. That's why no one watches the news anymore." Happy for uploading the real video, he said, "Now people will see what really happened." The drone had captured Park using the board to circle around the fire, as if drawing a ring with the Earth Spirit's power. Then he activated the tornado skill, making the flames themselves wipe out the starfish. The video was titled, "Park's Tornado Skill," and the comments exploded. Some doubted it was real, others asked if he was a god. Han was shocked. In just seconds, the video had more than 400,000 views. Another clip was recorded after the fire was over. Drones hovered above the area as Han ran to Park, who had collapsed. The boy thought about cutting that part out. Showing weakness wasn't a good idea. But then he had a spark of inspiration. He could post it as a separate video. At that moment, someone called his name. Han turned, surprised. With a coffee cup in hand, he stepped out to the balcony and looked down. Junho and Jiang were down below. He asked if the two were heading into a dungeon, and they said a level 2-1 had just opened nearby. Junho said they still had 3 spots left. Han laughed and asked if they couldn't handle a level 2 dungeon alone. Junho said he had more skills than everyone combined, and Jiang added that Monk was already waiting in the car. Han thought that the guys had picked up a ton of different skills. Since the group was small, they needed to cover as many roles as possible. Before heading out, he asked for a moment to upload one more video to the channel, and his fingers danced across the keyboard. The message on the video said, "Park, I invite you to London, Dr. Toddler." The footage showed pure chaos, monsters terrorizing Earth, the skies completely overrun, and even the ocean was now inaccessible. Nothing seemed able to stop them. In the video, Park appeared with his back turned. Then he turned around and said he'd be back soon, asking everyone to look after the house while he was away. In the next shot, massive wings spread from his back, and he took off into the sky. The caption read, "Your adventure continues." The final scene showed Park flying toward the unknown. Han was pumped about the result and got a crazy idea. This could be turned into a movie. The video went viral. Even at the motel they were staying in, people were already watching it. Akiko, focused, watched the freshly posted video. She was stunned by the news that he'd gone to London. When Hiro came out of the shower drying his hair, he asked what was going on. She told him, her face tense, that it seemed Park had left the country. She showed him the video, and Hiro, visibly annoyed, snapped, "Why the hell did he go to London?" Hiro suspected that since Park was from the future, he already knew his moves. So if he was avoiding a fight, it meant he wasn't ready yet. And that meant Hiro had to reach him before he finished whatever he was planning. Akiko said they couldn't just wait for him to come back. And Hiro, with a sinister grin, replied, "Then I'll drag that bastard into the light." The girl, surprised, asked how he planned to do that. And Hiro answered without hesitation, "I'll provoke him." Meanwhile, completely unaware of Hiro's plans, Park was flying toward London, transformed into an eagle. He realized he couldn't fly as fast as he wanted, and at that pace, he wouldn't make it in time. When he opened his menu, he was shocked. Using Suri had a time limit. And worse, a bunch of new fire abilities had unlocked, but they were insanely expensive. Suddenly, the interface warned him, 60 seconds before transformation ends. Deep in a forest filled with massive trees, the sounds of a chase echoed. A bull was running for its life with 2 men on motorcycles hunting it down. "Don't waste bullets, aim properly," one of them shouted. "I already hit it 3 times and it's still alive," the other snapped back. "We're gonna run out of gas soon." "Come closer, Uncle Zhangshang," the younger guy yelled. "Just shoot it already." Zhangshang moved closer as his nephew took aim. "This is it." They got close enough, and he fired. The shot hit the bull's leg, making it roar in pain, but it kept running. "Am I gonna need a machine gun for this thing?" Right then, the guy spotted something falling from the sky. "Uncle, what's that?" Something wrapped in lightning crashed right in front of the bull with insane force, throwing the animal back and blasting a cloud of stones into the air. The bikers froze, scanning around nervously. The impact had left a crater. The kid asked, "What the hell fell from the sky?" Zhangshang just replied, "Doesn't matter, just grab the bull." But then, a thunderous scream echoed from the crater. They both froze. "Uncle, what was that sound?" Suddenly, a bright light started shining inside. The lightning flickered violently, and the scream got louder. Zhangshang, scared, stared into the crater. "What is that?" the kid asked. "Is that a person screaming, or an alien mimicking a human voice?" Then, a human hand shot out from the hole, crackling with electricity. Zhangshang drew a knife and braced himself. The two stood there, tense, until Park emerged from the crater holding his head. "Thought I was gonna die like that," he groaned in pain. The kid turned to his uncle. "Yeah, Seems human, alright? Of course I'm human, Park said, trying to steady himself. My name's Park, and you guys are… I'm Chul Yong, and this is my uncle. How'd you survive a fall like that? It was a fall from hell, Park said, stretching his neck. Where am I? Chul explained where they were, said there was a river nearby, and told him they were still in Park's country. He added that his accent sounded southern and asked, but what were you doing falling from the sky? Park laughed. Well, first I was flying, then I fell. Chul, taking it all in, said, if you survived all that without a scratch, you're one of those strong awakened ones, huh? Park hesitated for a second, then answered, yeah, strong as hell. The man still gripped the knife tightly and asked if Park was alone or with allies. He replied that he did have companions, but he was traveling alone. The uncle then said he wouldn't stop him. They were just hunting the bull, and it should be around there somewhere. Zhangsheng told Chul to look for the animal, and the boy glanced around, saying it couldn't be far. Park, still disoriented from the fall, wondered if he'd really been flying in that direction. He stuck his hands in his pocket, searching for his phone, but nothing. Frustrated, he wondered where it could have fallen. Without overthinking, he activated his clairvoyance ability to locate the device. He found it nearby in the bushes. When he picked it up, he let out an annoyed sigh. The phone was wrecked. Meanwhile, the men finally found the bull, which had been thrown quite a distance away. They even doubted if it was still alive. The uncle was stunned. None of their bullets had done anything, but one single hit from Park had knocked the beast out cold. Chul asked if they'd have to cut up the animal to carry it back. The uncle said hauling it whole would be a challenge. They'd spend all day skinning the meat and would still have to keep wild animals away on the way back. Even so, he pulled out his knife, saying that if they didn't bring the bull back, the villagers would starve. Suddenly, Park appeared on top of a rock and called out to them. He asked if either of them had a blood crystal phone since his was broken. Chul said there was one in the village, but the uncle quickly cut him off. There are women and children there. How are we going to take an awakened one back with us? Chul realized he'd said too much and immediately apologized. While they talked, Park walked over to the bull and lifted it like it weighed nothing. The man was shocked at that insane strength. Park then made an offer. He'd carry the bull to the village in exchange for the phone. The two men stepped aside to whisper. Chul commented that he was incredibly strong, and the uncle added that even bullets wouldn't work on him. Even so, Chul insisted they had to bring the bull. The village had nothing left to eat, but the uncle fired back angrily, reminding him what the awakened ones had done last year. They'd disguised themselves as nomads, were welcomed warmly, then brought their allies and massacred everyone. Park interrupted. Are you going or not? The two men got on the motorcycle, and the uncle started the engine. Park followed on foot, carrying the bull in his arms. Zhangsheng told Chul to hold on tight, saying there was no way Park could keep up with them. The engine roared, and the bike sped off at full speed. Chul felt guilty for leaving the bull behind. The uncle shouted, "Forget him! We'll get to the river and hunt another one." But their plan was ruined. Park appeared right next to them, running with the bull in his arms like it was nothing. The two men's jaws dropped. "Watch out!" Park yelled. Right ahead of them was a cliff. Before they could react, the bike flew over the edge, the two of them screaming. In the village, things were chaotic. The gate was smashed, and a group of villagers gathered around. When they saw Zhangsheng, they were stunned and asked if it was true a bull had been chasing him. "No, it wasn't the bull. There was someone carrying the bull next to him," shouted one of the villagers. As soon as Zhangsheng parked the bike, the villagers ran up to him. A man asked what had happened and why the gate was like that. Injured and bandaged up, the villagers quickly explained. One said it was like an entire herd had passed through. Another approached the uncle and said, "We all went to save Heon." John, already tense, asked what had happened to her. The villager explained that a winged creature had attacked the village. It was monstrous, murderous, and on top of that, it breathed fire. Despite everything, one of the villagers managed to get everyone to the shelter, but when he turned around, he saw Heon lying on the ground. The beast noticed she was alone and grabbed her by the arms, flying off with her. That was where the story ended. The monster had taken Heon away. Zhangsheng, filled with rage, shouted, "Where did it take her?" The man tried to calm him down, saying the elder had already gathered a group and gone after her. But Zhangsheng was out of his mind. He kept yelling, demanding to know where the creature had gone. Finally, the villager pointed toward the mountains. They went that way. Without hesitating, Zhangsheng jumped on the bike and sped off, ignoring everyone shouting after him. Chul, eyes brimming with tears, turned to Park and begged, "Please, save our Heon. I'll never forget this." It didn't take much to convince Park. To everyone's surprise, he agreed immediately. He said that when he got back, he wanted the phone as payment. In an instant, blue lightning wrapped around his back and huge wings grew out. In the blink of an eye, Park took off into the sky. The villagers stood in shock, asking who that man was. One guy said he was a southerner, a young nomad. Watching Park fly like a lightning bolt through the sky, he added that he was also a beast master. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a colossal bear was roaring, foaming with rage. A group of men tried to lure it into a trap and run away, but one of them tripped, lost his balance, and was thrown to the ground. The bear was almost on top of him. His companion, helpless, could only scream his name as blood splattered through the air. The fallen man was flung helplessly as the bear closed in fast. With one brutal swipe, the beast sent him flying aside. Consumed by fury, one of the men drew his knives and charged in, trying to avenge his partner. But the monster was too agile and too strong. With a single swipe, it scattered the group. One man yelled, "We have to retreat," but another snapped back, "Are we really going to run away?" Someone shouted, "Watch out!" And in the next instant, another swipe from the bear hit one of the men. Coughing up blood, he murmured, "At this rate, we're all gonna die." They started to lose hope. They wondered if it even made sense to keep trying to save Hyeon. Maybe that winged creature had already devoured her. Of all the awakened ones in the village, only 4 remained. They couldn't afford to lose anyone else. As the bear raised its paw again, ready to crush another man, something struck it with massive force. The beast was sent flying. It was Park, in his eagle form, who came soaring down from the sky and kicked the beast right in the face. The men stood speechless, not understanding what they were seeing. Before them stood Park, surrounded by a swarm of shimmering crickets and with glowing wings on his back. They all asked at once, "Who is he?" "I'm just a man," Park said. "But Chul asked me for a favor." "Where's Hyeon?" One of them explained that the flying creature had taken the girl to its nest somewhere in the mountains. He also said they'd been caught off guard by the bear. The others were still recovering from the hits. Park then made a bottle appear in his hand and said, "Since you've got injured men, you'd better use this potion." One man took the flask, stunned by how valuable it was. Meanwhile, Park pressed on. He needed to know exactly where the girl had been taken. Suddenly, the bear reappeared, roaring behind him. Without even taking his hands out of his pockets, Park landed another kick. The beast went flying again. He then hit the creature's belly and, with an upward kick to the chin, launched the bear into a spinning flip in midair. Park landed softly while the bear crashed down on its back. Despite the impressive scene, the system showed that the bear's integrity was still almost untouched. Suspicious, Park stared at the beast. "Playing dead, huh? Open your eyes, come on." The bear obeyed instantly, locking eyes with Park, who then gave the command, "Get up and obey." The gigantic creature sat down in front of him, completely submissive. The men couldn't believe what they were seeing. Park had tamed the giant bear. The system asked for a name, and he named the beast Ilgon. He learned that it had once been the king of the forest, until that winged creature came, defeated it, and stole its territory. Park smiled and said, "So you know where she went. Let's go after her and get your revenge." Ilgon let out a mighty roar, showing he was ready. At that moment, John arrived, pulling up on his motorcycle. He ran up to the group, out of breath. One of the men asked why he'd come back, and he just said, "Doesn't matter. Where's Hyeon?" No one knew what to say. The truth was, they had no idea. Park looked at Youngshung and promised, "I'll bring Hyeon back, but in return, you'll keep your end of the deal." Only then did John realize who Park was, and was stunned to see him there. Wasting no time, Park gave Ilgon the order, "Take me to the right place," and the two of them set off, leaving everyone behind, speechless. As they ran, Park's body began to glow blue. Lightning wrapped around him, and his wings reappeared. With one leap, he took off into the sky, soaring toward the mountains. The men stood frozen, realizing they were in the presence of someone who not only commanded beasts, but could become one himself. Jongsong fell to his knees as he watched Park disappear into the sky. He clasped his hands together in prayer, desperately hoping he could save Hyeon. Meanwhile, grotesque sounds echoed from a nearby cave. The winged creature was devouring half a deer, sitting atop a pile of bones. In a dark corner near that horrific scene, Hyeon cried out in despair, calling for her father. The sound of the girl's voice caught the monster's attention. It whipped its head toward her, growling, drool and blood dripping from its jaws. Terrified, Hyeon curled up, covering her face with her hands. But before the creature could get closer, Ilgon, the giant bear, appeared behind her, ready to face the enemy. The monster turned and lunged at the bear, but Ilgon was already braced for the fight. Behind him, a massive eagle swooped in. It was Park, ready for battle. Just as the monster was about to sink its teeth into Ilgon's armor, something unexpected happened. Park's body glowed blue and merged partially with the bear, one of his eyes now shining red. He instantly recognized the enemy. It was a young wyvern, still wounded. The creature tried to bite Park's claw, but he countered with his other paw, striking the monster hard. Then he grabbed the wyvern's neck, hurled it far, and blasted a fireball after it. The creature smashed through the cave wall and plummeted like a rock. Park then turned to Hyeon and promised, "I'll save you, but for now, stay right here and keep quiet." At that moment, another wyvern crawled back into the cave. Park wondered if he could tame it. since his spatial energy was higher. The interface revealed that to tame a wyvern, its integrity needed to drop below 10%. He realized it was possible. However, a sudden urge to destroy the creature surged through his mind, and his body moved on its own, hitting the monster with full force. The wyvern smashed through another cave wall and fell. Its integrity dropped to 16%. Park realized that Ilgan's hostility was spiraling out of control. His emotions were running wild. Once again, the desire to kill flared up, and his body readied for the finishing blow. With a fur-covered paw, he struck the wyvern hard, but in his mind, he screamed at himself not to kill it. Knowing Ilgan wouldn't stop, Park canceled the transformation. The bear returned through the blue portal, disappearing. The wyvern, now battered, tumbled down the rocks. When its integrity fell below 10%, Park activated the taming skill. An exclamation icon popped up above the creature's head. It worked. He immediately triggered instant healing, and the wyvern's integrity began to rise. Once 99% of its wounds were healed, Park gave the order, "Fly." Still growling, the creature fell for a moment, then steadied itself and regained flight. Riding on his new companion, Park soared up into the sky. The wyvern, now glowing with a blue healing light, flew all the way to the mountain peak. Down below, the villagers froze at the sight. They gripped their weapons, ready to open fire. Zhangsheng, overwhelmed, couldn't bear the weight of the moment. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered apologies to his missing daughter. Seeing Zhangsheng's pain, the other men fell silent too, thinking of Heian. Then everyone went quiet. One man pointed to the sky. "Isn't that the same creature that attacked?" Another shouted, "State of emergency! Shoot it!" Guns were raised. Fingers tightened around the triggers. But the village elder shouted, "Stop! Don't shoot!" Everyone froze. "There's someone on the creature's back!" Another man confirmed, "There's someone riding it! It's Heian!" Zhangsheng couldn't believe his eyes. The wyvern landed gently in front of him, and Heian, smiling, ran straight into her father's arms. He couldn't hold back his tears. She was alive and safe. Later, the whole village gathered around the bonfire. They roasted meat, ate until they were full, and talked about Park, now known as the Dragon Knight. More meat sizzled over the flames as someone joked that the baby needed more food. Another admitted they were still afraid to get close to the winged creature. Park watched the children playing with the wyvern and thought about how gentle it had become after being tamed. He even discovered that he could now see the past of any beast he had tamed. The wyvern's story was heartbreaking. Her horde had been almost wiped out by the Sky Alliance. She was so young that she always flew behind the others, which ended up saving her life. After crossing the borders, she starved, suffered injuries, and after an attack on the village, she ended up finding Ilgan's den, where she decided to hide. The village elder thanked him out loud. Thanks to what Park did that day, they could finally celebrate. With magic, he had provided food, healed the wounded, and even repaired the damaged houses. He shared that even before the government collapsed after the catastrophe, they already lived in poverty, but despite that, they were happy. Until, united as they were, they still couldn't resist the monsters and had to flee. The city became uninhabitable, so they moved deeper into the continent. Before, many other nomads took the same path. Now there was almost no one left. Hunting was impossible. Nothing would grow on the land. Wild animals attacked alongside raiders. The chief revealed that when they left the city, there were 400 of them. 2 years later, only 60 remained. And that very day, they had been planning to leave again, because staying there was no longer an option. Curious, Park asked if the continent was safe. The answer came with sorrow. There was no safe place anymore. Those regions were vast, filled with monsters and bandits, but the elder had heard rumors about certain areas protected by magical barriers where civilians could find refuge. The problem, he said, was that without connections, no one could get in, especially if they spoke a different language. They were just refugees. Making it there alive would already be a miracle. That's when Park remembered what Miso had said. Soon, all of Asia would become a massive battlefield, and refugees would end up coming straight to their lands. The nomads had also heard from the guards. If they couldn't defend themselves, they should ally with someone who could, but that would come at a cost. The chief stood up, saying everyone was already drunk, and suggested they sleep there for the night. He mentioned they had prepared a room on the second floor for Park. Chol explained the place was a bit messy, but he'd sleep well, but our hero declined with a smile. He said he needed to leave. The elder, worried, said it was already late, but Park replied calmly that it was fine. The man nodded, saying they had kept their savior there long enough. Park smiled awkwardly and said it wasn't like that. The elder then asked Chul to fetch the blood crystal phone from the room. The boy ran off to get it. Meanwhile, the villagers started gathering to say goodbye to Park. Behind him, the wyvern was already ready to fly. The hero received the phone and commented that the navigation and satellites were working perfectly, and that he'd put it to good use. The leader told him there was no need to thank them for anything. After all, he had saved the entire village. That's when Park's hand began to glow. A sphere of electricity formed in his palm, and the villagers watched in awe, thinking he would use magic again. Suddenly, dozens of blood crystals fell from his hand. The villagers were stunned by how many there were, and their value. As he left, Park wished that the crystals would help them too and said his goodbyes. The entire village thanked him, wishing him a good journey. He waved back, saying they would meet again. The wyvern spread its wings and took off into the sky, and Park shouted, "We're going to England!" Jongseong held Haeyeon's hand tightly as they watched the hero's silhouette disappear over the horizon. The scene cuts to a news broadcast. The anchor announces breaking news. A horde of wyverns had been destroyed by the Sky Alliance, but that morning the Air Force had found another wyvern. But this time, there was something different. The creature was being controlled by an awakened. The story went viral. The appearance of an unknown dragon knight was being celebrated by many. The broadcast switches to footage of a destroyed bridge. A collapse had just occurred. 2 giant fire ants had emerged from a portal and turned everything into a true inferno. But then, something came running across the bridge. The anchor asked the camera to zoom in. On screen, a man with long hair appeared, wielding 2 swords. The commentators were stunned. Was that the #1 hero? What was he doing in a neighboring country? Questions spread quickly. Could it really be him? The similarities were undeniable. The news confirmed it. The most powerful awakened had appeared out of nowhere on that bridge, alongside the Scylla Guild. In just 10 minutes, they wiped out all the monsters. The commentators were divided. Some called him a traitor, others defended him. But one headline dominated all the papers. The Dragon Knight had joined the troops on a mission to purge the scorpions. And now, the greatest summoner awakened were gathering there. Everyone wanted to know, who is he really? Who is this so-called Dragon Knight? In the past few days, new reports have come out that the Dragon Knight returned to support the troops, this time facing ogres. Based on the information gathered, it was finally confirmed. The mysterious knight was none other than Park. The commentators didn't hold back their praise. They called Park a god, detailed his abilities, and even suggested he deserved the title of the new #1, but then, a bombshell. A breaking news report revealed that the current #1 hero, Hero, made a direct accusation against Park. The anchor explained that Hero's unexpected statement, along with his return to the country he had once abandoned, caused an uproar. He then invited everyone to watch the interview together. The reporters got straight to the point. They wanted to know why he was accusing Park and what brought him back. Hero didn't hold back. He said he came personally to expose that the so-called God of the Wind and legendary Tamer was actually a fraud. The press conference exploded. The journalists demanded an explanation. Why call him a liar? Hero claimed that Park ran away as soon as he found out Hero was coming, too scared to be exposed. He added that Park's videos and feats were all exaggerated. According to him, Park was nothing more than a regular tamer with no professional evaluations, promoted only because the government profited off his image. A reporter noted that this all sounded like a personal feud and asked if he had anything to say directly to Park. The hero looked straight at the camera as if he knew Park was watching and threw down the challenge. "If you want to prove me wrong, meet me at SPFC Station." Meanwhile, elsewhere, Han took a sip of coffee and muttered, surprised, "Damn, the media's full of this hero saying he'll crush Park with one hand." Another news piece showed Park alongside the Russian president, highlighting their friendship. Watching this, Junho wondered how Park, who was supposedly heading to England, ended up in Russia. The phone rang. It was Park's guild. Junho picked up. On the other end, they wanted to know if he had managed to reach Park, but the answer was no. Han asked if the agency director had called again, and Junho confirmed with a sigh. Han found it strange. Not long ago, Junho could barely stand hearing the director's name, and now he was taking calls daily. The mood at the base was tense. No one was finding anything in the dungeons, and even one exhausted man suggested they give up looking for money and settle for whatever loot they had. Han lamented that now everyone needed Park, and Junho wanted to know why this time. A new news segment explained, Level 7 dungeons were appearing more often. The locals were worried and hoped that Park's guild would take charge of the 13th district. Junho mentioned that lots of people wanted to move to this new area of the city. Han said that this was the perfect time to act. Junho, a bit annoyed, said the director had told him the same thing, which surprised Han. The proposal was that, once the district was officially recognized, they would be responsible for protecting that land. The agency would handle the taxes and take care of the minor dungeons on their own. Han, impressed, asked what Junho said. He replied that they were still thinking about it, but in Han's eyes, they should have accepted already. The agency wanted the guild to form a special squad to act whenever new dungeons appeared, but Junho made it clear, As long as his brother was away, he couldn't make that decision alone. He didn't know if they could handle clearing level 7 dungeons and founding a new district at the same time. Han reflected. If they became a special task force, the respect around them would change completely. But on the other hand, it would also mean taking on much greater risks. He glanced at a picture of Park next to the president, with the wyvern painted in the background. He thought about how the entire country was in chaos because of the hero's statement, the new district, and no one knew where Park was. Han asked Yunho if they had any contact with him, and he just shook his head. At the same time, in a ruined city, a red car sped through empty streets. The gray-haired man behind the wheel called out to Park with a slightly nervous voice, wanting to know if he could hear him because he was already on his way to the rendezvous point. On the other end, Park replied, asking if he was the guy in the red car. The man confirmed and welcomed him to London. He then asked if Park could see the 3 stone golems chasing the car. Our hero said yes, and that he'd take care of it right now. From above, riding his wyvern, Park began to descend, eyes locked on the 3 golems closing in behind the car. One of the golems, the one closest to the car, raised its massive hand and boom! The impact opened a crater right next to the vehicle, cracking the ground like shattered glass. But before the car could be crushed, a huge fireball appeared out of nowhere, slamming into one of the golems with brutal force. The creature was hurled into a building, smashing the facade with its own body. The 2 remaining golems roared furiously, but at that moment, Park flew past them on his wyvern, grabbing the monster's attention. With a flick of his hand, he released tiny shimmering lights, fire fairies. Right after, he activated his fire tornado, feeding the flames with bursts of wind. The destruction was so intense that the 2 golems collapsed with no chance to fight back. Park approached the first monster, and a pillar of flame exploded from his hand. Then, he turned to the second one and landed a precise kick to its head, which cracked instantly. The creature's jaw flew off, smashing through a wall like paper. Looking at the mess, Park remarked that they seemed weaker than they looked, probably because of their low level. His wyvern then landed nearby, sending up a gust of wind. Behind him, he heard clapping and shouts of admiration. Park turned and came face to face with a gray-haired man snapping a photo and saying excitedly, "You're exactly like the rumors say." Our hero asked if he was Professor Toddler, and the man confirmed with a smile. The wyvern flapped its wings, and the professor marveled at the creature. He asked if it was the famous wyvern. Park explained that the Russians had suggested painting it so people wouldn't confuse it with the wild ones. Toddler, clearly grateful, said that even if just for a short time, he'd felt the presence of the Dragon Knight, and thanked Park for saving him. Park joked that the professor's translator worked really well. The man showed off the device, saying that when he heard about the meeting, he bought the most expensive one available. Park glanced around, a bit suspicious. "Is this really London?" The professor answered that things were rough all over England, but London was pure chaos. And when the sun goes down, everything gets worse. Park got the picture and prepared to leave. He opened a portal and called his wyvern, which he had named Biryong. Biryong slowly stepped into the portal while the professor watched, fascinated. The portal opened into a place full of wolves. On the other side, the animals watched as the wyvern crossed through and the portal closed. Once inside, they all gathered around the creature. It let out a roar, and the wolves howled back together. Someone commented, "That must be the same wyvern from the news." Another added, "They say she lives on a farm with other domesticated beasts, all sweethearts." Meanwhile, the red car sped down the road. The professor still couldn't believe what he'd just seen. He said that for a wyvern that size to pass through a portal, the level of the place must be at least 3. Park confirmed, "Looks like you're pretty well informed." The professor said yes. After all, Park was the main topic on the news these days. He added, excited, that he was happy they finally met. But Park didn't look that thrilled. Deep down, he felt like this whole conversation reeked of a scientist eager to run experiments. The car sped through the ruins toward the coast, where monstrous creatures swam in the river. Park asked if his lab was in London, and the professor explained that the city was in the past now. The new capital of England was New Dover, and that's where the lab was set up. Park asked why they hadn't arranged to meet there directly. The professor explained he needed to pick up some materials from this location, especially after the recent bombings that left lots of blood crystals scattered around. He said he was researching the creation of instant teleportation stations, portals that could summon creatures. According to him, the portals used by monsters during Rift events work the same way. Just imagine how amazing it would be if we could use that. No monster could ever stop humanity's progress again. Park didn't look convinced, but politely replied that the idea sounded good. The professor went on, saying that at the moment, even river and air routes were blocked. If nothing changed, humanity would end up isolated. and survival would only get harder. The car sped across the bridge over the river, until the professor awkwardly added, "I guess I'm talking too much." But Park didn't even blink. His eyes stayed locked on the road ahead. The man asked why our hero was in such a hurry to meet him, but Park answered in a low voice, eyes fixed seriously on the road. Careful. In the next instant, the asphalt on the bridge just exploded, like something gigantic had torn through it from below. A massive sperm whale emerged, breaking through the structure with its snout and launching the car backward with brutal force. The professor gripped the steering wheel in panic, yelling, "Is that a whale?" But Park didn't just see the whale. He instantly read its info. Level C2, integrity at 18%. And as if that wasn't enough, a colossal shark burst out of the water, and near them, tentacles started to surface. Even with the car flying through the air, the professor wouldn't let go of the wheel. He screamed in terror, "That's a megalodon!" Meanwhile, an epic battle was raging under the destroyed bridge. Whale versus megalodon. The car plunged toward the water, the whale crashing down behind it. Military forces rushed to the scene, helicopters in the sky, soldiers speeding across the surface on motorized boards. One helicopter reported that a small vehicle had been hit and requested immediate civilian evacuation. A soldier on a board asked who was coming to back them up, and the answer was direct. David and Silva, the legendary duo, including the mighty Muscle Queen. David, a burly guy with a ponytail who liked guys, took charge and asked if the red car was Professor Toddler's. A soldier confirmed it seemed so. David dove in, his eyes glowing like spotlights, lighting up everything underwater, and soon enough, he found the car, but it was empty. The soldier looked around and saw the megalodon chasing the whale, which was several times smaller. The shark nearly caught up, but the whale twisted at the last second and escaped. Moments later, it breached the surface, throwing up a massive curtain of water, and the shark followed in a brutal leap. From above, the soldier saw the commotion and prepared to open fire. But one shouted, "Wait! There are people on the whale's fin!" It was Park and Professor Toddler, both relieved to be alive. Park looked at the shark and analyzed, "Level D3, young specimen." He extended his hand and activated his tornado ability. Immediately, a blue light engulfed the shark, pulling it into a magical vortex. One soldier, watching from afar, recognized it. "That looks like a tornado. I saw something like this on YouTube." David, back on the surface, muttered in disbelief. "It's him, the Dragon Knight." Park then summoned his fire fairies, and the tornado transformed into a massive fiery whirlpool. With the whale out of danger, the military moved in to finish the job. Helicopters closed in, opening fire on the burning shark. Meanwhile, the professor still clung to the whale's fin, stunned by what he was witnessing. He thought to himself, "He trapped a megalodon in a fire tornado, and I saw it with my own eyes." At that moment, Park turned to the whale and asked if it was happy to have avenged its mother. The creature said nothing, but gave him a grateful look before diving back down into the deep. Below, a soldier watched the burning megalodon crash to the seafloor and shouted, "It's going down!" The shark hit the bottom with a thunderous impact. That's when Park realized his level had increased, and his water affinity skill had been cancelled. Later, in a calmer place, a small cottage sat near a cliff under the bright sun. At the table, coffee and biscuits waited. The man asked if Park had slept well. He said he had, and looking out at the sea below, added, "This place is amazing." The professor agreed, and almost as part of the conversation, a whale leapt from the water, splashing waves and foam. Professor Toddler explained that because of monster attacks, blue whales were becoming increasingly rare, but that one had been lucky. Park smiled and said, "This village really does feel like the end of the world." The professor nodded and said that English troops had been surrounded by monsters for a long time. There was nowhere left to run. That's why the country had started building impenetrable walls. But Professor Toddler confessed that he was still haunted by what had happened that night. Professor Toddler commented, surprised, that he was still amazed by how Park could tame and control so many different creatures. But what really blew his mind was the fire tornado, seeing that live was surreal. Meanwhile, Park calmly sipped his coffee. The professor said that, to this day, there had never been an awakened one capable of controlling all four elements: water, fire, earth, and air. He smiled, curious, and asked what life had been like for our hero before awakening. Park replied that his life was the most ordinary thing in the world until the day he ended up in the animal kingdom. That's when everything changed. Then our hero asked if the professor was the one who created the device that measures spatial energy. The professor confirmed proudly, "Yes, that's my work. Did you like it?" But Park cut straight to the point. What kind of laws are behind that? The professor was caught off guard and wanted to know why he was asking. Park explained, every time his energy was measured, he felt like he was being watched. A strange discomfort, like someone or something was observing him. The atmosphere grew heavy. Professor Toddler looked visibly uneasy, unsure how to answer. Park continued. He said it was connected to the planet he'd returned from. According to him, that planet had been shattered, fragmented, and now reappears on Earth in the form of dungeons. And those level 4 dungeons, they were just a tiny part of what that world used to be. Instead of the friendly animals he once knew, the place was now overrun by lizard men, creatures he'd never seen before. Then he asked, what happened to his old companions? Why hadn't he aged a single year in 1,000? And who were the ones watching him whenever his energy was measured? This time, the professor confirmed. Everything Park said was true. He explained that all of Park's questions, his sudden interest in languages and writing, it was all connected. They opened a hatch in the floor and started descending the stairs. Down there, the professor revealed that this was his real lab. Park commented that the place was deep, and the professor explained that it was designed to withstand even a nuclear explosion. Despite being a personal lab, all of it actually belonged to the government, and Park was the first outsider to ever set foot there. At the end of the stairway, the professor typed a code, and the door slowly opened. "This is it," he said, lighting the room with a flashlight. Park fell silent, taking in the scene before him. The lab was huge, but a total mess. Stuff was scattered everywhere. Professor Toddler chuckled and said that despite the appearance, the place was fully equipped. He showed a series of devices, analysis stations, test samples, even a robot capable of recreating projects from codes and identifying voices. On another workbench were stones and flasks filled with minerals extracted from dungeons, all being analyzed right there. On the monitor, notes made by Park in that cave were displayed. The professor explained that all this material had been found over the last 2 months in various dungeons. And the most impressive part, they had found inscriptions in the human language inside these dungeons. Yes, Park's language. These inscriptions had been appearing repeatedly for the last 21 days in every dungeon they explored. Park was stunned. He asked, "Are there different versions of the same dungeon?" The professor answered yes. Dungeons with the same pattern had started showing up in different cities around the world, with levels ranging from 2 to 5, and they didn't appear at the same time, but in different moments. That made Park remember something Miso had said. Dungeons open near awakened ones. Maybe this proved they weren't just fragments of a planet, but rather the dungeons themselves replicating. Park asked if the planet had actually been copied and shattered. The professor admitted that so far, that was the most convincing theory. Then our hero asked, "And what about the animals that live there?" The professor admitted that was a question he also wanted answered. "Is that why you wanted to meet me?" Park asked. "Exactly," said the professor, holding Park's hands eagerly. He confessed that he hoped to discover how the dungeons appear and disappear with Park's help. Someone had contacted him recently, the author of those inscriptions. Ever since he received Park's letter, he'd been restless, unable to wait for this meeting. He was desperate for answers, and called Park the Dragon Knight. But Park felt frustrated. Deep down, he thought the professor didn't really know anything. Trying to change the subject, the professor brought up the spatial energy meter and said he'd show the device right now. He began rummaging through one of the lab's boxes until suddenly he exclaimed excitedly, "Got it!" and pulled out a strange-looking stone. The man showed the stone to Park with a satisfied smile, and our hero asked what it was. The professor held the stone out to Park, explaining that it was called a memory stone. He said you had to hold it in your hands and close your eyes. Without questioning it, Park touched the stone, which immediately began to glow. As soon as he closed his eyes, he saw those strange inscriptions again, as if someone were watching his every move. When he read that his data had been recorded, he opened his eyes suddenly, his expression tense. The professor, curious, asked what it felt like. Park replied, uneasy, that he clearly felt a strange gaze while holding the stone. The professor said that everyone reacts differently, but the more sensitive ones usually feel that way. Park wanted to know if it was possible to make an energy meter using that stone. The professor confirmed that it was, but explained that he wasn't the one who created the stone. Surprised, Park asked what he meant, and the man with a calm smile explained. He said the stone fell near a portal on the day of the Great Catastrophe. It was much later that they discovered its properties. Park asked if the stone literally fell from the sky. The professor replied that although Europe suffered greatly, it also received a blessing, the divine stone. It fell exactly on the day of the disaster, and thanks to it, they started exploring space. The professor explained that the information inside the stone allowed them to create many devices. Then he turned to Park and showed him a box with several vials, saying that it was one of those inventions. Inside, there was a holder for stones. Toddler managed to embed a memory stone there. Park didn't seem too impressed, but the man added that he managed to transfer all the information contained in the stone to the device. He explained that the stone absorbs information from any contact, has a limit, but still works very well. He handed the box to Park and asked him to touch it. Without hesitation, Park placed his hand on the object. Seeing the results, the professor was thrilled, saying that Park had managed to surpass energy level B in just 3 months, something unheard of, even for someone so special. Park asked if that was really a portable meter, and the professor confirmed, excitedly saying that he still wanted to shrink its size. He explained enthusiastically that he had recently developed another device and showed it to Park, who asked if it also used the same stone. The professor confirmed, adding that this case had extra functions. He said the stone could store an impressive amount of data, revealing physical indicators. Park, curious, asked what kind of indicators he meant, noticing the word agility on the screen. The professor explained that with this device, it was possible to know the level of strength and dexterity, which would help form more efficient teams, not just by energy level, but also physical power. Park listened in silence, processing the idea that, until now, no awakened one could see other people's stats. With an excited smile, the professor asked what Park thought of it, and he concluded that, in practice, there was no way to see another awakened one's stats before. The professor said the prototype was ready and invited Park for a demonstration the next day. Our hero returned the box, agreeing to join, but suddenly, the screen showing Park's strength and agility stats started flashing. An error alert popped up, and the professor, surprised, said that hadn't happened yesterday. A bit embarrassed, he turned to Park and asked for a moment. He grabbed his phone, called the director, and said he'd have to cancel the demonstration because of a device issue. Meanwhile, Park flipped through an article about him and Songyi, but got annoyed when he saw they used a quote from a cave, exactly the line he hated. The professor hung up, saying he wanted to continue the conversation, but an urgent matter had come up. Park took the chance to ask if he knew where those stones came from. The professor answered without hesitation that memory stones are extracted on the planet Aruka. Meanwhile, the sun was setting over Park's guild, painting the trees and fireflies in shades of orange. Gunwoo and the monastery boys were playing in the sand when a threatening shadow appeared over them. Hiro was standing there, holding 2 swords still dripping with fresh blood. Gunwoo froze, staring at Hiro, and one of the monks murmured in shock that it was blood. The man turned to the child and the young monks, who stood up, staring at Hiro. Gunwoo was the first to snap out of his trance and asked who he was. Choi's clothes and face were stained with blood, and he asked the boy if he really was Gunwoo. Meanwhile, Park had no idea what was happening at the guild and asked the professor about planet Aruka. The man explained that those memory stones weren't that special. They just reflected the same wavelength unless broken into pieces. If blood crystals worked like batteries, memory stones were like data transfer devices. The High Elves used them to stay connected. Park wanted to know who these High Elves were, and the professor explained they were high-ranking elves. He added that the spatial energy measurement device was just a bonus, because the original plan was to build a network to connect the elves, and later, a network for the entire Earth. With a smile, the professor said this information came straight from the elves who arrived on the planet. Back on Aruka, elves use these stones to measure energy, class, and other attributes, meaning you can't hide any information from them. Park was surprised, wondering if those elves saw the same status window he did. He opened his own and was shocked to see all the professor's information: rank, class, profession, basic traits. But suddenly the screen glitched and showed the message, no signal. Annoyed, Park thought the system was acting up again. Meanwhile, the professor noticed that Park wasn't paying attention and felt awkward. He said he needed to fix the box, even if it meant staying up all night. He made it clear he wouldn't leave the lab until he solved the problem. Park just smiled politely and said he didn't want to get in the way. The man asked him to wait a bit because the guide would soon arrive to show him the city. On his way out, he advised Park not to wander too far since there were plenty of shops on the main street, and he promised to continue the conversation the next day. Alone in the lab, Park looked around while he waited. On the screen, he read that time moved twice as fast inside dungeons, and that the inscriptions on the rocks were over 200 years old. He analyzed everything, thinking how ridiculous it all was. In front of him, a table was covered with memory stones of all shapes and sizes. Park picked up one of the stones and once again saw the inscription saying they were watching and recording his data. Then he had a sudden realization. Maybe the High Elves knew who was watching him and what caused the great disaster. He thought he needed to visit Aruka in person. Suddenly, a man appeared, coming down the stairs and calling his name. Park turned around, pushing the thoughts away, and asked if he was the guide. The man introduced himself as William from Lawrence Corporation, saying he was a pioneer in the measurement field. Park didn't waste any time and said he had somewhere he needed to go. He pointed at the screen and asked if he could get there. The man explained that was the South Portal of London, in the 11th Infantry Brigade's operations area. William asked if he wanted to join the dungeon sweep, and Park agreed immediately. The guide looked a bit uneasy, but agreed to accompany him. Meanwhile, Professor Toddler was in his office, trying to figure out what had caused the error. He double-checked everything, found no faults, and wondered why the device only glitched when scanning Park. The man was completely puzzled when suddenly the door opened. A man stepped in, asking if the professor was there. It was David, who came in, greeted him, and asked where the Dragon Knight was. How could he miss a chance to see him up close? The professor explained there had been an issue and said the guide was handling everything. David, a bit disappointed, still pressed him, asking if he was sure he wasn't around. The professor confirmed and asked him to place his hand on the scanner. Since he was there, David obeyed, curious. Right away, the screen displayed his strength and agility stats, and the professor lit up. Everything was working perfectly. David, impressed, realized those numbers were his physical indicators, and he stared at the results, fascinated by the new invention. The professor commented that he expected nothing less from a rank C awakened who had already reached the strength limit. David felt flattered, but admitted, a bit embarrassed, that he'd be happier if his results were in 4 digits. Otherwise, he still needed a lot more training. Those words made the professor's eyes widen, as if a new idea had just struck him. David said he was going to look for the Dragon Knight, said goodbye to the professor, and left. While the man was still lost in thought about that 4 digits, suddenly, he started typing frantically on the keyboard, muttering that 999 had been the maximum until now. He thought, what if I open Park's data and raise the limit to 9,999? As soon as he did, he stared at the result, eyes wide, and let out a curse, completely shocked. Outside the lab, a gigantic monster was restrained by thick chains, bound to 4 war machines surrounding the creature. A black car drove by slowly, and one of the men commented that the monster was immobilized for research since it would die anyway, so the company decided to buy it. William was driving, with Park sitting beside him, silently observing everything, until the man said they had arrived. Ahead of them, a portal shone with an intense blue light surrounded by a military camp. William explained that it was a level 5 dungeon, infested with giant locusts, and only 18 hours remained before it would explode. On a screen, a video played showing a famous comedian dressed as a locust, yelling at a guy that he would kill him, with a slogan that read, "Forward, warriors, the crazy locust awaits you." Laughing, William said the soldiers were trying to profit off the comedian's popularity. Further ahead, Park saw a squadron of aircraft fighting a massive wyvern. He asked if the attack had already begun, and William explained that more than half of all territories were in constant combat, but dungeon invasions never stopped. Suddenly, a shout echoed, "Watch out!" A downed helicopter was plummeting toward them and crashed into the ground with a loud boom. Its blades broke off and flew straight toward William, but Park caught them with one hand, stopping everything right there, leaving the man speechless. Someone shouted, asking what had happened, and they answered that the helicopter had crashed, but the rest of the platoon had already pushed into the dungeon. The soldiers looked at Park, and one asked who that man was. Another recognized him immediately. It was the Dragon Knight. William thanked him, and Park asked why, genuinely surprised. The man answered without hesitation, "For saving my life." William then said they could consider the dungeon entrance settled now. He pointed to a group of uniformed men and said, "There they are, the Lawrence Corporation's combat team. These guys are rank A, chosen especially for you." He introduced the man in front, saying he was the leader of the Phoenix squad, Robert. Robert greeted Park, saying he was the captain of the 2nd Phoenix. But our hero didn't even care. He just walked forward, saying he didn't need any team. He'd enter the dungeon alone. William was speechless, trying to convince him not to go in solo, reminding him it was a level 5 dungeon, but Park didn't care. He told them not to follow and stepped into the portal, instantly enveloped by the blue glow. Inside the portal, Park opened his info window, grumbling that it still didn't work properly. He closed it, muttering that B-rank monsters didn't even reach 1/400 energy. Outside, William still called his name, but the hero had already taken his golden eagle form and vanished into the light. The man sighed, incredulous. Robert, from the squad, said he saw no reason to follow him if he didn't want their help anyway. The soldiers murmured among themselves, some saying they were being looked down on, others arguing that even if he was the Dragon Knight, they should stick with him. William apologized to Robert, who replied that it was fine. They were still waiting for the official mission to begin. The soldiers kept discussing Park's attitude, while William ran a hand through his hair, wondering what he was supposed to do now. Just then, a red SUV pulled up next to them. Everyone turned, curious to see who'd arrived. Out stepped David, in a hoodie. waving at William. As he got closer, he said everyone was already gathered and asked Robert why he was there instead of hunting locusts. Robert shot back, asking what the hero who's supposed to save the entire world was doing in the village. David defended himself, saying he didn't deserve to be judged, but Robert bluntly said that for now, he could absolutely judge the 9th in the world ranking and 1st in England. Robert cracked a half smile and said they needed to get ready for the mission, adding that they'd see each other at the farewell party. David shot back, asking if he was serious, that he'd really have to see that drunk face at the party too. In the background, the soldiers murmured that sometimes these veteran chats were enough to make anyone sick. When the conversation ended, William called out to David, his eyes welling up. The big guy bent down a little, laughing, and asked why his dear William was crying, and where the Dragon Knight was. The young man, annoyed, replied that he'd just gone alone into a level 5 dungeon. David's eyes widened in surprise, and William added that Park had gone in so fast he hadn't even been able to stop him. The kid, now staring at the ground, muttered that he didn't know what to do. If anything happened to Park, he'd probably get fired. Suddenly, David burst out laughing, leaving William even more confused. The big guy explained that this was exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from a Dragon Knight. Seeing William's stunned face, David said he clearly didn't understand much about the Dragon Knight, but William insisted that it was still a level 5 dungeon. David just waved it off, joking that he'd be waiting at the cafe with a pink ice cream and told him to let him know the moment Park came back. But suddenly David stopped, feeling something strange. He turned, pointed at the portal, and shouted, "Park's back!" William couldn't believe what he heard, but it was true. Park came out of the portal, brushing the dust off his uniform like nothing had happened. William let out a scream of pure shock. It was simply impossible. Meanwhile, the soldiers were doing a final gear check, ready to enter the portal. They were talking among themselves about how the previous combat teams hadn't come back and doubted they'd be able to contain the rift. One asked if the place would be overrun by locusts now, and another replied that the National Bureau had already requested reinforcements. Worried, a soldier asked what would happen if the rift opened while they were still inside. His buddy, sweating, said he didn't even want to think about it. Just then, one of them lifted his head, went pale, and asked if he was seeing things. His partner asked what he was talking about. The soldiers ran to Robert, telling him Park had already returned. The man, incredulous, took a moment to process the news. Meanwhile, William ran toward Park, overjoyed, while David shouted, calling him Dragon Knight. Park recognized David immediately and said he was the big guy he'd seen before. But the two didn't have time to talk because all of a sudden someone yelled, "The fire boar had escaped!" David turned and saw the colossal monster covered in flames charging at them. William, terrified, stammered that it was a fire boar. But David was furious when he recognized the beast. That giant pig had destroyed his favorite ice cream shop. Fueled by rage, David clenched his fist, shouting that this wouldn't stand, and activated Megan's strike. His fist glowed a bright blue before slamming straight into the boar's head. The impact was so strong that the monster was sent flying backward, crashing into a crowd of soldiers who scrambled to get out of the way. The soldiers, amazed, murmured among themselves that this was exactly what they expected from David, the true living storm. Park was also impressed by the punch, gave a wide smile, and said that was seriously strong. David walked up to Park, shook his hand, and said that even though they'd met before, he wanted to introduce himself properly. Park returned the handshake, and David confessed that he'd been waiting for this moment since that day. Our hero, confused, asked why David had looked forward to this so much. The big guy explained that he'd seen Park turn a megalodon into fish food, and ever since, he realized the two of them were a lot alike. David asked if Park knew how he'd gotten so muscular, and Park just raised his eyebrows, curious. Then David, proud as ever, said he'd seen a cave painting of Park training with giant bananas. Everyone laughed at that, but he saw a brotherly spirit in that image and started training with bananas too. Park, stunned, asked if that was for real, and David swore it was. He even showed a photo saying, "Look how I was at my worst." Park looked at the photo, pretending to get it, while David explained he'd even worked on a banana farm. They'd always given him strength. That made Park remember that, in a way, bananas had saved his life too. He thought it was incredible that someone actually connected with those drawings that had become a joke to everyone else. And in that moment, he decided he liked David. David finished by saying not to get hung up on numbers and asked if Park could really beat monsters using only muscle. Our hero gave a confident grin and said that was easy. David, fired up, said he wanted to see Park fighting monsters in hand-to-hand combat, no special abilities, and Park, without hesitation, accepted the challenge on the spot. William tried to step in on their conversation, asking them to wait a second, but David and Park didn't even listen. They stepped right through the portal, leaving William and all the soldiers staring, curious about that scene. Headlines exploded in every paper. David and Park had saved England by clearing the dungeon 15 times in just 40 minutes, well before the rift could open. All the associations, including the Lawrence Corporation, officially thanked Park. Even the Queen of England made a point of honoring him, granting him a knighthood. Miso and her boss read the news, stunned by everything. She commented, amazed, that he had just saved the country, but the boss just held his head, exhausted, asking if there was still no word from him. The boss asked if his dungeon had been cleared yet, or if they'd found anything interesting inside. Miso said they'd found nothing. The boss let out a heavy sigh, as if he'd expected that answer. She tried to lighten the mood by asking if they could get the money back. The man grumbled that a level 7 dungeon was about to appear, and money was the last thing on his mind right now. With a sly smile, Miso teased him, wondering where all that patriotism came from, since he was planning to run the moment the level 7 dungeon showed up. The boss brushed her off, changing the subject, and told her to think of a way to get Park back in the country as soon as possible. Miso chuckled, saying not to worry. The moment he saw the internet, he'd come running back. The boss raised an eyebrow, curious, and she explained that just an hour ago they'd posted a new video on their channel, and that Hiro had really stirred things up. Curious, the boss opened the video and widened his eyes, totally confused. Meanwhile, helicopters fired at a colossal monster while, nearby, there was a wild party to celebrate clearing the dungeon. Champagne glasses clinked under a burst of fireworks. David, pumped up, told Park that this was the best day ever, even better than the day he caught the tentacle shark. Park thanked him for the compliment and added that David's fists had done a great job too. Then David asked if he'd met Sylvia while he was in Russia. Park, confused, asked who that was. The man laughed, saying she was a pretty famous tamer. As soon as she heard about Park, she dropped everything to fly to Russia. And it wasn't just her, a bunch of tamers wanted to see him up close. Park was surprised, asking why so many people were so eager to meet him. David explained, it was because he was a dragon knight. There wasn't a single tamer in the world capable of taming a wyvern like him. But Park didn't get all the fuss, saying that was actually pretty easy. Suddenly David got serious and warned him. Either way, he'd better not take the bait. Park raised an eyebrow, asking what he was talking about. David asked if he hadn't seen the news. A recent article said that Hiro claimed he wouldn't even need a single hit to defeat Park. Our hero looked puzzled, asking who that guy was. David, surprised, said they were from the same country, but that Hiro had run off somewhere else. Park looked at the article, not recognizing the name, saying he'd never heard of the guy. David took a deep breath and explained that Hiro was actually the #1 in the world, but behind all that fame, he was a total maniac, a killer. Park frowned, tense, wanting to know why they called him a psycho and a murderer. David went on. Hiro had done a lot for the world. He was the best. But he was also unpredictable. David himself had once had the chance to fight him. He lost, of course, but he said it was the best fight of his life. That day, when David admitted defeat, Hiro just laughed, saying only the strong had the right to judge a fight, and that ignorant guys like David needed to learn how the world really worked. With a chilling stare, Hiro promised he'd show him the price of arrogance. David told him that right after, he took a brutal beating. He said he'd seen the devil himself in Hiro's eyes at that moment, and he raised his hand, covered in scars, explaining he'd needed 8 complicated surgeries to rebuild it. As Park listened, he still struggled to believe someone could be so cruel. David finished by saying that many who challenged Hiro ended up dead. Even those who surrendered didn't escape, and that's how he earned the title of killer. Park, stunned, asked why someone would do that. David sighed, saying nobody really knew for sure, but repeated firmly, whatever the reason, it was better not to provoke that guy. Our hero, still confused, murmured, "What did I do for him to want to provoke me like this?" The news spread fast. Hiro had crossed the line and attacked Park's territory, and Hiro himself claimed he was just defending himself. Park, shocked, muttered if that bastard was really invading his land. David, who had no idea either, looked at him, confused. Inside Park's guild, a voice echoed, demanding to know why they'd taken so long to contact the boss. But Park cut him off and ordered them to just say what had happened. Junho explained that Hiro had stormed in, yelling that if Park didn't show up, he'd kill everyone. 2 wolves on patrol were killed on the spot. Park heard it all, stunned, and asked who had died. He kept saying that shouldn't have happened. If they'd been attacked, he should have gotten an alert. He opened his status window, but all that popped up was no signal. He cursed out loud. Park realized the alarm hadn't triggered because of a status window error. Furious, he thought. While pack members were dying, what were the others doing? Were they so trapped they couldn't even leave the area? He shouted, demanding what everyone was doing during the attack. Someone yelled back, asking what he expected. It was Hiro, the #1 in the world. our hero started to lose it. Junho, staring at the screen, begged him to come home as soon as possible. Park just scoffed, determined that once he got back, he'd push them so hard in training they'd beg for death. David, listening in, asked if he really planned to go back. Park said he had no choice, but David warned him. It was obvious this was all part of Hiro's plan. He said he didn't know why Hiro was so fixated on him, but it clearly had a purpose. It was rare for a champion to mock an unranked newbie like that, and in the middle of a fight, an accident could easily happen. But Park shut him down, saying it was fine, and asked Toddler and William to say goodbye for him. David just stayed quiet, watching him leave with a worried look. Park raised his hand, trying to summon his wyvern, but instead of appearing, nothing happened. He just stood there, waving his hand, puzzled. Toddler, watching everything through the monitor, wondered why David had brought up the news. The man whispered to himself that he'd wanted to keep Park there longer and murmured that he'd understand later. Meanwhile, Park glared at his skill window, growing impatient, staring at the countdown. Finally, the window came back online, showing invasion. 2 wolves dead. He read the names, murmuring to himself, overcome with sorrow. In a flash, the summoning skill activated. A portal opened next to him, and a wyvern emerged into a hall full of people who all started whispering about it. David, mesmerized, watched with a huge grin, while the professor followed it all on the monitor. On the screen, it said the ability wouldn't be available again for another 23 hours. The professor held up a blue glowing stone, an artificial mineral created by fusing the memory stone with atacamite, the arukamite. He reflected on Park's abilities, realizing they were exactly like the superior elves. He understood that when Park touched the arukamite, it caused the status window to glitch, shutting down any skill that used spatial energy for an entire day. The professor thought silently that if humanity kept developing like the elves, there would be consequences. But that thought hung in the air. At the same time, in a high part of the base, a phone rang. David called the director, who asked if he was still with Park. David said he'd already left and mentioned he'd stored all the info in the stone. The director, surprised, asked if Park had left earlier than planned and ordered David to return to HQ. Meanwhile, the professor was still staring at the monitor when his own phone rang. It was the director. The mustached man wanted to know if the test had worked. The professor confirmed that everything went exactly as expected. The director smirked and asked if he'd gotten it right. If it worked on Park, it would work on the people of planet Aruka too. The professor confirmed, but warned that the elves were close allies. They needed to be careful. The director, with a cold smile, countered, "No alliance lasts forever," and according to him, the elves could turn on them at any moment. The professor pointed out that there were still plenty of other problems to solve before the project could actually turn a real profit. The director, on the other hand, snapped back, saying that crime among Awakened was only rising, and that their alliance with the elves could fall apart at any moment. Toddler still tried to argue, but the director cut him off. He said that soon the levels would truly match real power, and they needed a way to control that. The professor hung up the phone, thinking to himself that the real problem was Park's power reaching 8,000. Would that be enough to take down monsters like him? While all this was being discussed, Park was already flying on his wyvern, set on revenge, with no idea what was happening behind the scenes. He growled to himself, wondering how Hiro had the nerve to invade his land. He was dead set on crushing him. Meanwhile, back at Suho's guild, Han asked what was going on, but Junho just let out a heavy sigh. He showed his phone to the others and said they were screwed. Everyone's eyes went wide, and Monk asked what the hell was happening. Junho brought the phone closer so they could see, and they all froze in horror. On the screen was a single message from Park, special training for whoever committed the crime. They freaked out, clutching their heads and screaming, "Why? What did we even do?" Han, almost in tears, asked how they were supposed to face the number 1 in the ranking when he could easily handle even a C rank. Suddenly, a picture popped up on TV, showing the 3 of them standing in front of Hiro. The comments exploded, calling it a disgrace for the guild, cursing Monk as a fraud, and saying they should leave the country. Han said it was a frame from one of his videos, while Junho, head down, said those were the comments from Hiro's guild forum, calling them all weaklings. Jang grumbled that people really were rotten. Junho, eyes welling up, said no one was on their side, even though they were the victims. Jang turned to Han, demanding why he uploaded the video. The boy explained he just wanted to expose Hiro. Monk said there was no way to undo the mess now. The shame was already out there. Han snapped back, saying someone shouldn't have gotten drunk all night, picked a fight with civilians, and ended up caught by the Bureau. Monk went red, turning away, grumbling that he just tried to help small shopkeepers but ran into monsters disguised as people. Junho said that either way, no one was safe now because Park was genuinely furious. Monk shot back that everyone had left the guild to hide from the barrage of hate. Jung asked what the bureau said, and Han replied that all they'd put out was a one-liner. "We're sorry." They all stood there stunned, not believing that was it. Jung exploded, saying a foreigner had illegally entered the country, invaded the guild's territory, attacked and caused damage. But no one did anything, and they should have held him responsible. Out of nowhere, Han shouted that he'd just seen a report saying Hero had already gone back to his country. Everyone panicked. They couldn't believe they'd just let the guy leave. Monk clasped his hands and started praying to the Buddhist god of mercy. Jang, furious, said he'd go raise hell at the bureau. Junho tried to calm him down, saying the bureau would probably play dumb and leave them to deal with it alone. Jang wondered if Hero was part of a security agency, and if this would end up as some personal vendetta. Monk sighed, saying the real losers here were the officials, dumping every problem onto citizens. Jang concluded, outraged, that the worst part was seeing everyone turn on them when they were the victims. Han read an article from the US saying that Park's guild should move to a superpower country where they'd have protection. Junho agreed they were right. It wasn't that they were weak, it was that their country was weak. They really should consider emigrating. Han said Park had to fix this mess, and asked if they'd all seen that bastard's eyes. Hero, bleeding, had said that if they didn't bring Park to him within 10 days, they'd all be dead. They all stood there, trembling, frozen in front of Hero, and Junho, stuttering, said they'd wanted to fight back, but they couldn't even reach Park. Jang, almost crying, admitted he'd been so terrified he'd turned to stone, unable to move an inch. Han added that if they'd fought back, they would have died on the spot. Junho said if they'd fought and died, it would have been even worse for Park. So yeah, they'd done the right thing. Han asked about Gunwoo, since the monks were still in shock, and Junho said the boy was fine but quiet. He spent his days watching TV in his room when he used to wander the territory, even scaring off the wolves. Deep down, Gunwoo even seemed a bit happy to have seen Hero up close, and Han said the only thing they could do now was wait for Park to come back, because when he did, he'd crush Hero to dust. Junho turned to Han and said they needed to do something before Park got back. But the boy didn't get it at all and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, the two of them were already walking through the farm area, and Han asked why he was the one picked for this. Junho replied that, unlike the others, Han didn't have anything better to do. They walked around holding metal detectors. Junho commented that they'd buried that stuff there before they left, and Han muttered that it felt like looking for a needle in a haystack. Suddenly, Junho's phone rang and he answered it. On the other end, Miso thanked him for their continued cooperation and said they'd only been able to explore the dungeon because of them. Funyo answered that they had a signed contract, so there was no need for thanks. Miso asked them not to blame the government for what happened before. Gunho, keeping a polite tone, said goodbye to her. Then he walked over to Han and suggested they head over to the animal farm, but Han immediately refused. Junho said those people were always planting bugs in important places anyway. Han asked him not to be so harsh on Miso, reminding him that she'd always been on their side. Junho agreed but added that sometimes the enemy is closer than you think. Han admitted he was right and said it didn't hurt to be careful. The farm was filled with every kind of creature. A pack of wolves, an elephant, a bear, a massive rabbit, and lots of birds. Seeing it all, Junho remarked that they had so many animals there, and Han nodded. Down below, a huge bear and a giant black rabbit were fighting each other. Watching the scene, Han asked if they were just playing, but Junho stayed silent. He only said that the family was growing, but the owner wasn't around. Then he asked where he was. Han remembered an article saying that Park had been seen riding a humpback whale near China. Junho said that if he was in the Sea of Japan, then he was already close to home. He asked if there was a lake on the farm, but Han reminded him that Park had been taming animals even before he had a farm. It was obvious Park had sharpened his taming skills during his journey. He'd even frozen the sea to wipe out monsters. Suddenly, Junho stopped, staring straight ahead. Han's eyes widened when he saw what Junho had noticed. Two little monkeys sitting up in a tree, staring back at them, curious. Han asked if they were Japanese monkeys. Then it hit them. Impossible. The news showed that Park was attacking the city where Hero lived. They both read the headline in shock, repeating it out loud. A wyvern flew over the city as people looked up in fear. Park descended on the wyvern, and people started shouting, recognizing him as the Dragon Knight. In an instant, the wyvern flapped its wings and everyone ran for it, screaming that it was a monster. On the live stream, they kept saying that Park was attacking the city, and all the comments were bashing our hero. Park roared, yelling for Hero to come out and face him. Junho and Han watched the live feed in shock. Han said that was exactly like Park. People in the comments were stunned, saying he'd come for revenge, while Park kept shouting, calling Hero a bastard. The news said the Dragon Knight was in the city center looking for Hero, and that he'd entered the country illegally. Even though he'd blocked traffic, he hadn't done much damage yet. The Federation of Awakened's criminal task force arrived at the scene. The reporter looked surprised to see the vehicle, and confirmed it seemed to be Lieutenant Saseki's #1 squad. The man was walking out front, followed by a team of uniformed agents, while people whispered that it was him. The reporter announced that the #1 team was already on their way to the scene, and the comments blew up saying Park was done for now. He added that a whole battalion of Type 10 tanks was headed there too, along with a squadron of unmanned drones. Seeing all that, Han said in disbelief that this time Park had really stirred up some trouble. Meanwhile, everyone inside the local Ministry of Defense building was being gathered urgently. The operations center was dead silent, but everyone moved fast. One operator announced that the tank squad was ready. Another said the drone combat battalion was prepped too. On the screen, a wyvern appeared with a huge red circle hovering above its back. Another agent reported that a combat satellite had locked onto the target. Two men in the operations center watched everything closely on their monitors. The vice commander of the Federation of Awakened informed the Minister of Defense that his team was trying to bring Park over to their side. The minister replied that Saseki had already arrived on the scene and suggested it was better to wait and see if Park was really on their level. Meanwhile, Saseki was approaching the spot where Park had landed, surrounded by the excited cheers of the crowd. Park kept yelling, demanding that Hero show himself, when he suddenly heard Saseki calling him. Our hero turned, curious, to face the man coming his way. Saseki announced that Park was under arrest for trespassing, inciting panic, and other crimes against public order, but Park ignored the entire speech and just asked if he was Hero. The man answered seriously that his name was Saseki from the police department and ordered Park to get off the wyvern and surrender. But our hero just looked at him with disdain and said that if he wasn't Hero, he'd better get out of there. The crowd gasped. He just refused to cooperate with the famous Saseki. Suddenly, black ropes shot out from red circles in Saseki's hands, wrapping around Park and the wyvern. The crowd erupted, shouting that this was the legendary Saseki's bind. Park looked at the restraints around him and let out a surprised laugh. Saseki yelled at him not to move or the vines would tighten even more, but Park just spread his arms, calmly examining the dark ropes. Seeing that, Saseki leapt in to attack, yelling that he'd arrest him by force now. The commentators on the live broadcast said Saseki only needed 1 minute to take Park down, already saying goodbye to him. But the one who took a punch to the face wasn't Park. It was Saseki himself. Park punched him so hard that the man flew straight into the sky and the ropes around Park shattered. The crowd held its breath in shock as they watched their hero fly through the air. Saseki crashed near Park, landing flat on his back. But it was a trap. He quickly got up and triggered another trap. Even then, he couldn't process what just happened as blood started dripping from his nose. Park smirked and said, "That's right. If your territory's under attack, you defend it to the end." At that moment, the wyvern flapped its wings, snapping the binds and letting out a roar so loud that everyone flinched. Seeing Park's power, Saseki admitted to himself that he was scared. He thought, this is exactly what you'd expect from a Dragon Knight. And if he hadn't triggered a debuff right when he got hit, his face would have been crushed. Park told him that if he already knew that, he'd better get lost. But Saseki lunged at him again, saying that now he'd also charge him with assaulting a police officer. Our hero just looked at him with disgust and muttered, "What an annoying guy!" Saseki jumped, yelling, "Die!" as he tried to stab Park with a knife. In that same moment, Park raised his hand and activated Air Whirlwind, summoning a swirling wind that caught Saseki off guard. The crowd, which had been cheering before, fell dead silent. This time it wasn't admiration, it was pure fear. In the command center, the Minister of Defense and the Vice Commander of the Federation of Awakened watched the screens in disbelief. The wind tossed Saseki around mercilessly, slamming him hard into the corner of one building, shattering it to pieces. Then he was thrown in the opposite direction, smashing through the windows of the building next door. The men in the command room were horrified by what they were seeing. Junho was stunned, saying Park had actually sent Saseki flying, and Han commented that this was so typical of their brother. Park kept yelling, demanding that Hero show himself instead of sending henchmen. The wyvern breathed out a pillar of fire, making the soldiers yell at him to stop, shouting they were only there to protect civilians. In the comments, everyone was shocked. Saseki was being tossed around like a rag doll, while Park showed off all his strength. The Secretary of Defense remarked that Park was even more impressive than he'd expected, and said Park seemed like a better asset than Hero. The Vice Commander said Park had sent an invitation to join them, and that they'd accept as soon as air travel was back. Meanwhile, Park shouted that if they didn't bring Hero out, he'd burn everything within a kilometer. The crowd heard that threat and panicked, running and screaming in terror. One soldier in the command center said civilians were at risk, and they needed to take out the Dragon Knight using the satellite. But the minister just smiled and said things were getting interesting, asking why everyone was so nervous. The minister asked the vice commander of the Federation of Awakened what they would do next, and he replied that Lieutenant Messi was already getting ready. Suddenly, someone behind Park shouted at him to stop, and our hero turned around. A big man in uniform stood facing him, staring him down without fear. Park opened his info window and saw that this man was just an ordinary person. Surprised, he asked who he was, while the wyvern let out a threatening blast of fire. Without flinching, the man introduced himself as Messi from the police department and politely asked him to stop all this. Park said he'd only stop if they brought Hero out, giving them a 30-minute deadline. But Messi explained that Hero couldn't come right now, which made our hero curious. Then the lieutenant said seriously that Hero was inside a level 7 dungeon. Park repeated out loud that he'd gone hunting and asked exactly where he was. Messi explained there was no way to see him now, since Hero would need 10 days to get out of there. Park was shocked. He'd been provoked by someone who needed 10 days just to clear a dungeon. Confused, the lieutenant said it was still a level 7 dungeon. Park replied that he'd come back in 10 days when Hero returned. Messi agreed, but warned him that he'd still have to pay for everything he did today. Our hero let out a sarcastic laugh, saying it was their mistake. Stealing pups or eggs while the leader's out hunting was cheap thief behavior. The lieutenant smirked slightly and promised he'd pass that message along. The wyvern flapped its wings and soared high as the citizens watched in fear. Back at headquarters, someone said they couldn't just let Park escape like that because it would bring global humiliation. But the minister shot back that using the armed forces against one single awakened would be even worse. Even so, he reminded them that Park had promised to come back and asked the air fleet to follow him. As our hero flew back home, a few helicopters tailed him from a distance. Then Park looked back in surprise when he saw a huge dark portal open on the ground below. Flying closer, he thought it must be the gate to planet Kuchan. While Park was returning, headlines were already blowing up, saying he'd declared war on Hero. Back at Park's guild headquarters, the guys lifted bottles in celebration, saying this was exactly what they expected from him, making everyone pay in kind. The news also reported that Saseki had been taken to the hospital with a concussion after just one hit. The government treated the incident as a direct attack and demanded that Park be extradited, or they'd declare war. Meanwhile, the ministers gathered for an emergency meeting, but still hadn't released any official statement. In the comments, some were calling for Park's extradition. Others said he'd done nothing wrong since Hero had even killed the wolves, and many were terrified of war. Han remarked that it really seemed like the world might go to war because of Park, and Junho, excited, asked what they'd do. The kid joked that they should head to the US. Nobody would dare start a war with them. Zhang suggested they discuss that calmly when Park got back to the guild. Suddenly, a pigeon flew in through the window, cooing loudly. Then everything outside started glowing blue, lighting up the whole room. Gunwoo's voice echoed, shouting that Uncle was back. The guys tensed up immediately. Park, furious, asked where the cowards were who needed to answer for this mess. The kid said they were drinking in the office. Seconds later, Park opened the door, and just his stare was threat enough. The air turned heavy. Junho was the first to speak up, saying his brother was finally back. Park's eyes glowed an intense blue as he asked, annoyed, what they'd been doing. Someone screamed, "Run!" and they all bolted in a panic, diving through the window and smashing the glass to escape his wrath. Meanwhile, in a mansion up in the mountains, a heated meeting was going on. Some people were shouting that they should send Park away. Others yelled they wouldn't give in to anyone's blackmail, and that if it came to that, they'd send Hero there too. The Foreign Affairs Secretary complained that all this happened because Park always got away with everything, so now he thought he was invincible. But the Minister of National Security shot back, saying it all started with Hero, so it didn't make sense to blame everything on Park. The Foreign Affairs Minister got irritated and started cursing until someone suggested they take it outside instead of filling the room with swearing. That's when a man in a black suit stood up and said, "Seriously, the president has arrived." A man in a yellow t-shirt who looked like the oldest one there sat at the head of the table, and everyone stopped arguing immediately, falling into a tense silence. The president got straight to the point and asked if Park and Hero had any connection. The assistant secretary replied there was no link between them at all. The president wanted to understand why all this had happened then, but no one could come up with a clear explanation. He said he'd heard that Hero had started it all, but wondered why someone who betrayed his own country would pick a fight with Park. The head of the bureau said they had two possible theories. The first one was simple. Hero might just be jealous of how fast Park's popularity was growing abroad. One of the men in the room shot back that if that was true, then Hiro didn't deserve to be number one in the rankings, acting like a child. The president turned to the defense secretary and asked bluntly, if it came to war, did they stand any chance of winning? The man took a deep breath and said that if it were 10 years ago, with a huge budget and a decade to prepare, maybe they would. Hearing that, the president didn't hesitate. He ordered them to hand Park over. The Minister of Defense went pale, asking if that was even possible. The others began murmuring that it was the only option. If war broke out now, they'd all be doomed, so they needed to think about the people's safety. But the head of the bureau raised his hand and said their second theory was even more likely. The president, surprised, wanted to know what it was. The man explained that maybe it was all a foreign government's plan to force them to give up Park. The president's eyes widened. If that was true, then the threat of war was just a trap. The bureau chief stressed that, with how drained both countries were, conflict was practically unavoidable. But one thing was clear, they needed Park. The president asked for confirmation. Was Park really that strong, since he hadn't even returned like Hiro? The chief explained that Park was different from everyone else. Several countries were after him because of the powers he had. The president wanted to know exactly what powers those were, since so many seemed ready to risk everything. The chief revealed that Park was one step away from mastering all the elements controlled by the High Elves. After they discovered Park's powers, interest in Aruki skyrocketed, and no one there had regional magic. The ministers were stunned when they realized what it meant, magic on a regional scale. The agriculture minister, excited, asked if that meant instant harvests. The bureau chief confirmed it all. Park was basically a winning lottery ticket worth an unimaginable fortune. After that, the president and all the ministers agreed they would protect Park at all costs, even if it meant war. The president ordered the Minister of Justice to put Park on the VIP list and forbid him from leaving the country. Meanwhile, the chief thought to himself, where there's money, there's war. Headlines popped up saying the ministers refused to extradite Park. Another report claimed that the DGB was planning to build a massive grain storage facility on Park's guild land. Inside a black car speeding down the road, someone was thinking that, in the end, everything always came down to money. The chief wondered why Miso had said what she did, and he reminded himself that he'd been the one who kept Park from being deported. The girl asked if he'd talked to Park, but the chief explained there was no reason for Park to turn down their help. They were keeping him out of prison and giving him a chance to make money. He asked her to let Park know that soon they'd level the guild up to rank 6, so they needed to focus on expanding farmland. That way, the country would become the world's new breadbasket, overtaking Ruka. Miso said she'd already set it all up with Max, and that they'd meet Park the next day. The bureau chief was surprised they'd arranged it so fast. He said Park could smell money from miles away, and that he trusted Miso to handle it. She fired back, saying she always cleaned up the mess alone, but the chief snapped that he'd deal with it later. Meanwhile, near the level 3 Locust dungeon, Han, Junho, and Jang fell out of the portal and collapsed on the ground. Han couldn't take it and face-planted too, just before Monk appeared and landed right on top of them. Park glared at the three, furious, yelling at them to get up because they still had 10 more rounds to go. But Junho didn't even move. He sounded like he was snoring. Park was about to blow up when his phone rang. It was his grandma, and our hero answered immediately, asking what had happened. Grandma asked if he really forced the boys to keep training even during lunch, and Park answered that those brats had already eaten more than enough while he was gone. She passed the phone to Miso, who got straight to the point. She'd heard they'd been stuck in a dungeon for 3 days straight, going through insane training. Park confirmed it and asked what she wanted. She took a deep breath and said the country's reaction was getting pretty serious, but they had a solid plan to fix it. While listening, Park glanced at the boys sprawled on the ground, unable to move. He thought to himself that people have their own rules. Ignoring them could bring a lot of headaches. After thinking it through, he said he'd rather everyone talk it out at home and settle everything once and for all. On top of Park's guild house, the tree was growing taller and taller, casting a cool shade over the place. Under it sat Miso, Park, and another man. The girl introduced him as Max, head of the SPFC branch. Max greeted Park, saying it was an honor to meet him in person. As soon as they sat down, Park got right to the point. He wanted to know what the SPFC needed from him. Max explained that not long ago, the champion had challenged Park to a duel, and even repeated Hiro's words, saying he wouldn't even need to fight for real to win. Park's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked if Hiro really said that. Miso, caught off guard by his reaction, asked if he didn't already know. Park said he'd vaguely heard something like that, but didn't get the reason behind it. Max was honest. The whole thing was just for money. If the duel happened, the money involved would be massive. He suggested that Park shouldn't overthink it and just accept. That way, he'd make a fortune and still prevent a war. 2 birds, 1 stone. Park remembered David's warning that Hiro was a psychopath. a killer, and that it was better to stay away. So he asked if he accepted, he'd be allowed to kill Hiro legally. Miso and Max went silent at that. Max answered awkwardly that under the rules they wouldn't blame him if something happened, but they weren't exactly encouraging murder either. Miso cut in, telling Max she'd talk to Park alone and get back to him. Max agreed, wishing them luck with the decision, and left. As she watched the car drive off, Miso turned to Park and told him that if he didn't want to, he didn't have to accept. The war wouldn't break out anyway, but Park smirked and said he actually wanted to do it. She explained that Hiro's country's goals were crystal clear, either lure Park in or get rid of him, but Park just shrugged, saying he didn't care about their plans. Hiro was asking for a beating, and as long as it wasn't against the law, he had no problem with it. Miso then suggested they donate all the money they'd raised to Hiro's country to earn some political points. Park liked the idea and agreed right away. She smiled, saying she'd pass that on to Max. But she had one more thing. She handed Park an official document from the government. She explained that once a year, all guilds level 6 or higher gather together. Park flipped through the papers, confused, and Miso explained she was planning to invite him. He pointed out that their guild wasn't level 6 yet. Then Miso pulled out a small statue with the number 6 and said it was official now. Their guild had leveled up. She added that the certificate came straight from the bureau, and the entire working district would be handed over to them, with autonomous rights over the territory. Park was stunned, asking how that was possible. Miso explained that once the infrastructure was built and people settled in, that area would officially become the 13th district, under Park's guild's control. Park, half sarcastic, said that meant it was time for him to step up himself. Back in the office, he told the boys everything, but all four were against the idea. To them, the government hadn't protected anyone when they should have, and now they wanted the guild to defend the land. Park pushed back, saying the decision was already made, and the government had plans to build the city. Junho, surprised, asked if Park had taken the bait they could be getting used. Park said they could treat it like a demilitarized zone and expand the farm slowly. Han grumbled that it was disappointing, and that he'd rather take the money and move to the US. But Park shot back that he planned to make that area the official headquarters, and in the future, divide the new territory into sectors. Han, wide-eyed, asked if Park was really planning to make them run the whole thing. John commented that in the end, each sector would be managed by a mayor, but if Park decided to appoint sector leaders instead of mayors, then he'd basically be a lord. Han loved the idea of being a castle administrator and repeated the title all excited, while Monk read an article saying that, thanks to Park's lands, their country was about to become the world's new grain production hub. The boys started wondering if they could compete with Aruka's agricultural industry, which has trade gates all over the world, but charges a fortune for its goods. Han said that if this really happened, Park would basically become a real lord, owning a territory that rakes in an astronomical fortune. He even asked if the contract was already signed, and if Park kept 2 copies, so nobody could try to scam him later. Park snapped back, frustrated, saying they couldn't even defend their own house. How could they dream of being castle administrators? Then he added, if they were done eating, it was time to get back to training. Out of nowhere, Han doubled over, pretending to have a stomachache and yelling that he urgently needed to buy medicine. Watching that scene, Park started to lose his patience. But before he could completely blow up, Yang cut through the chaos by reading out a bombshell headline. Hiro had just come out of the dungeon. Right away, the guys started mocking, shouting things like, "Welcome to hell, Hiro, and he's done for now." The news said that Hiro's team managed to clear the level 7 dungeon in just 8 days. Another headline showed Hiro's response to Park's taunt. "I'll teach you some manners." They even showed TV commentary speculating about the upcoming fight between Park and Hiro. In one interview, a former world champion said that fighting face-to-face isn't the same as clearing dungeons. An SPFC commentator added that Park had absolutely zero experience fighting another awakened one in a one-on-one battle. Another article revealed that the biggest bet ever placed on Park's fight had reached 240 million. The guys read that in shock, blown away by the insane amount of money. Monk commented that even if they cleared the dungeon 100 times, they'd never see that much cash. That's when Junho asked Han to scroll down so they could read the rest of the article. Noticing something, another article said the protagonist had donated the entire amount to Hiro's country. Han shouted in shock, asking what was wrong with him. Why give away money he'd worked so hard for to another country? Junho suggested it was to avoid a war. But Han argued that even so, the angry comments hadn't stopped, and Monk reminded them there was also the payout for the winner. Han realized that the winner's prize was double. Jang asked if that was really true. Suddenly, the protagonist appeared behind them, coldly asking what they were doing there. The guys bombarded him with questions, trying to understand why he'd give away all that money when his own life was on the line. The protagonist just told them if they were done eating, they should follow him. He was going to check out Job's lands. Meanwhile, the bureau chief told the president that of course the amount had been adjusted. If they split 5 billion for each, it would be more than enough. And as a precaution, they'd signed an agreement that the protagonist would donate the prize to national funds, stopping all the war rumors. With a sly grin, the bureau chief told the president this was just the beginning, and that once the protagonist succeeded in farming, he stopped there, mysterious. Meanwhile, the protagonist was already flying on his wyvern toward his new lands to see how things were going. He remembered what Miso had said, that there used to be an HQ building there, and if they fixed it up, it could hold about 100 people. When he saw some old structures on the ground, he realized that's what she meant. Miso and the workers were already waiting when they spotted the wyvern landing. As it came down close to the ground, its wing beats stirred up a strong gust of wind. One worker asked if the wyvern had gotten bigger, and another said he was shocked to see it up close. The protagonist dismounted, and the wyvern immediately stepped into the open portal. Miso greeted him, asking how the view was up there. He said it looked good, and commented it'd be great to plant trees in a 4-kilometer radius. She told him that as soon as the area was marked, she'd send the paperwork for approval. The protagonist spread his arms, activating his skill, and fireflies began to gather around him. In seconds, a glow started to radiate from him, and the fireflies multiplied by the hundreds. One worker asked if he was famous, and Miso explained that this was how he marked territory. Nearby, the Mohawk guy welcomed martial arts fans, announcing that Sidekick was live with them. That morning, after a lot of effort, they managed to find Hiro's team in front of the level 7 dungeon. The reporter asked how Hiro was preparing for the fight, and he said he had no time to train. Hiro added that soon there'd be way more level 7 dungeons, and humanity wouldn't get a break. But the headline told a different story, that Hiro saw no need to prepare to fight someone like the protagonist. Meanwhile, the protagonist's team was eating, and Junho complained he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a hot meal. Monk said it was last Monday, and Jang told them to stop whining. Just then, Sidekick walked over and asked if they were the protagonist's team, the so-called walking joke. He wanted to know if they knew his channel, and if he could interview the protagonist. Han suggested he should go to Job, since he was probably there planting trees. An article soon came out saying the protagonist had disappeared and was busy planting trees, and nasty commenters started saying he was planting them just to be buried under them when he lost to Hiro. Meanwhile, Akiko was sitting in an office, staring at her monitor and the access denied notice. She tried another combination and waited nervously for the result. On the Bureau of Awaken's personal info screen about the protagonist, the message popped up, access granted. She smiled, proud she'd cracked it, and opened the folders marked confidential. Akiko opened one file and started reading carefully. Suddenly, her face filled with shock as she thought, stunned, 1,000 years? In another piece, global betting experts said that 85% were betting on Hiro's victory. Another report highlighted that Hiro, also known as humanity's hope, had reduced the dungeon clear time to 8 days. One more article said the DGB had transported construction materials to the city, and at the entrance to the protagonist's lands, there was now a sign warning about wolves. A final report said there were 6 days left until the showdown, and the stadium was already sold out. A new article said the fight was only 2 days away, and the protagonist was still on his land. Meanwhile, Hiro and Akiko were sitting on the couch of the city's best hotel, sipping wine. The girl asked what Hiro was thinking about after taking a sip. He answered that he was thinking about how he'd kill the protagonist if he didn't show up for the fight. Setting the glass back on the table, Akiko said she didn't think it would be that easy. Hiro asked what she meant, and she explained she was talking about killing the protagonist. She told him she'd checked the Bureau of Awaken's secret files, and found it was recorded that the protagonist had returned after spending 1,000 years on another planet. Hiro was surprised and asked if he'd used the regression stone multiple times during that period. Akiko said she didn't think he'd used the regression stone like Hiro had, but he argued that it would be impossible to live 1,000 years without it. She explained that according to the records, the protagonist spent 10 years on a planet where time passed twice as fast, and considering that Hiro had spent 500 years on Earth regressing, it didn't sound that crazy. She added that it explained why he hadn't come across the protagonist during those 500 years. Hiro asked if he'd discovered the source of eternal youth. Akiko said there was a rare item called the Red Divine Peach. Hiro repeated the peach's name, waiting for more details. She explained that this fruit appears only once every 1,000 years on a planet and disappears after 10 days. This divine fruit grants immortality and eternal youth. Hiro said the guy was becoming more and more interesting to him. He'd managed to live 1,000 years without the regression stone. The girl admitted she was worried knowing the protagonist had lived even longer than Hiro. Hiro stood up and said that no matter who the opponent was, he'd never let anyone get in his way. News headlines were now all about how the protagonist hadn't arrived in the country on the day of the fight. Meanwhile, the protagonist was working on his trees back on his new land. Apples began appearing on the branches, and he watched the results while Han stood nearby. Our hero said that was enough for the apple trees. Han agreed, saying there really wasn't any more time, but the protagonist didn't listen and said the pear trees were next. The boy shouted that there were only 3 hours left and that he really needed to go. The protagonist replied that since his level was still low, he couldn't plant too many seedlings at once, and that while he was away, they needed to buy everything he'd ordered. Han told him not to worry and begged him to just go already. The next second, a portal opened behind the protagonist, and his uniform appeared inside it. A giant wyvern stepped out of the portal, scaring Han so much that he fell backward. The protagonist said he'd be back soon and that they had to clear plenty of dungeons. There'd be no forgiveness if they slacked off. Han scratched his head and asked what he meant by slacking off, but he didn't answer. The wyvern took off, carrying the protagonist, who grew smaller and smaller against the sunset sky. Watching him go, Han was shocked that the protagonist wasn't even a bit worried about fighting the champion. He couldn't believe he'd been out there planting trees this whole time. As soon as the protagonist disappeared, Han pressed a button on a remote, and several drones flew up around him. He grinned, saying it didn't matter, because he already knew what he'd use for the opening clip. And the stadium was already buzzing, the voices of the commentators echoing everywhere. One of them said there were only 3 hours left until the fight. The audience was brimming with anticipation. The man mentioned he'd heard the protagonist still hadn't arrived, and wondered why he'd decided to skip the showdown. The other said this wouldn't be an easy fight for a rookie going up against the champion, and that his country's government was responsible for the protagonist's actions. Hiro and Akiko also arrived at the stadium and sat in the waiting room, which had a huge wall-to-wall window. Hiro asked if there was any news, and Akiko said that not long ago, he'd expanded his lands in Job. Hiro suddenly smiled at the mention of the protagonist's new lands. He thought, as expected, the protagonist already knew what would happen in the future. After all, the first place to open a level 7 dungeon in the protagonist's country would be Job. When the dungeon opened, the combat team threw everything they had at it and got wiped out. The country lost more than half its awakened fighters from the sea and couldn't contain the monsters. Because of the explosions, Job was burned to the ground. After that, monsters overran the continent, and unable to stop the invasion, the protagonist's country fell. Hiro figured the government wanted to avoid that tragedy with his help, and wished the guy luck, calling him arrogant. The commentator announced there were only 7 minutes left, and by the rules, the participant would be disqualified if they didn't show up at least an hour before the fight. Suddenly, the crowd felt a strong wind pick up, and everyone looked to the sky, whispering, trying to figure out that sound. "Is it a monster?" they asked, terrified. Out of nowhere, a massive wing appeared over the stadium and the entire crowd started screaming it was a wyvern. Akiko stood up from her seat, watching the crowd now shouting, "He was there!" The commentator said, surprised, that against all odds, the protagonist had arrived riding his wyvern. David jumped with joy, yelling that he'd told everyone the protagonist would show up for sure. 2 men next to him said he'd created quite the drama. The head of the bureau cheered, shouting that if he won, the world would belong to the protagonist. Miso was watching the broadcast too, while the commentator kept saying he couldn't believe the protagonist had shown up just 5 minutes before the match. Soldiers in the field command center cheered along, shouting for him to defeat everyone. The commentator announced that the Dragon Knight was finally landing after circling the whole stadium. Choi, who was with the soldiers, heard his name and muttered it quietly. The protagonist jumped off the wyvern, which was now much bigger. Without a word, the wyvern growled and stepped into a portal, disappearing in front of everyone. The crowd roared, amazed by the summoning magic. The protagonist looked around and asked why there were so many people there, and where Hiro was. Then, he shouted for the whole stadium to hear that he wanted Hiro to show himself. The commentator explained that the protagonist seemed to be hunting Hiro inside the arena, watching as he called out his opponent. The crowd joined in, chanting Hiro's name in unison. Up above, hearing the chants, Hiro stood up and told Akiko he was going. The girl jumped up, grabbed his hand and tried to stop him, but Hiro smiled, telling her not to worry, he'd win and come back. Out of nowhere, white flakes started falling on the protagonist, while a bird flew over his head. He looked up, and the commentator shouted that Hero had arrived. The long-haired man dropped down from above, smashing the stadium floor on impact. The crowd exploded in cheers, celebrating the champion's arrival, but the protagonist didn't look surprised at all, nor was he scared. Calmly, he asked if this was really Hero, but Hero didn't answer. He just said he had a few questions before killing him. Hero asked if the protagonist was a survivor of the apocalypse, but he had no idea what Hero was talking about and shot back, asking what apocalypse he was on about. Suspicious, Hero said that was a terrible act. Our hero started losing his patience and demanded to know what nonsense this was. Then Hero asked if there was still a regression stone and how many years you could regress. The protagonist, still confused, asked what stone he was talking about. The commentator said they seemed to be talking and asked his co-host if he was curious about what they were saying too. The second commentator joked that maybe Hero was giving advice as the more experienced fighter. The first said if that was the case, they'd better listen and sent a broadcast drone closer. 3 drones quickly dropped down to the arena. Hero activated a skill and asked if the protagonist felt like he owned the world after coming back from the past. Our hero looked even more confused, asking how he could have come back from the past. That's when 2 blades appeared in Hero's hands. He said the protagonist was asking for this. He lunged, swinging the blades, saying he had a way to make him talk. The commentator shouted excitedly as Hero launched the attack. Suddenly, everyone froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. The protagonist's fist slammed into Hero's face, catching him off guard. The punch was so strong it sent the champion flying, a stunned silence falling over the packed stadium. Hero crashed to the ground so hard he left a crater in the floor as the protagonist walked slowly toward him. The commentator screamed that Hero was down, looked badly hurt, and wasn't moving. Our hero cracked his knuckles and said that, apparently, he was just another lunatic. He shouted for him to get up, asking if he was really dead already, and that's when Hero moved his hand. The protagonist mocked him, asking how the so-called champion could be so weak. He ordered Hero to get up because he hadn't gotten what he deserved yet. Hearing that, Hero opened his eyes and slowly pushed himself up. The commentator yelled in excitement that Hero had managed to stand, while the stadium watched, stunned, as the champion struggled to his feet, swaying. The crowd was shouting for Hero, cheering him on to get up and keep fighting. He looked at the blood dripping from his nose, confused if he'd been hit by some kind of magic. Park muttered that everything needed to follow its course, and that first of all, Hero needed to learn some humility. Those words made Hero snap. He charged, yelling at the protagonist to shut up, but his charge was cut short by another punch straight to the face. Hero froze, stunned, trying to understand how he didn't even see that punch coming. The next hit slammed right into his stomach, sending the champion flying again. Wasting no time, the protagonist activated his tornado ability. In an instant, Hero was lifted by a swirling current of wind mixed with glowing fireflies. Once the power was fully charged, Hero was launched high into the air, swallowed by a massive vortex of wind and water. The protagonist leaped above him, a ball of flames forming in his hand, the Fire Fairy Stream skill. He came down with his burning hand, slamming the fire straight into Hero, engulfing everything around them in a blazing flash. The arena crowd panicked. Some cowered, others covered their mouths in shock at what they were witnessing. Everything was on fire, wrapped in a column of smoke. The commentator nearly choked, saying Hero was getting one-sidedly destroyed, then corrected himself, calling it total annihilation. The second commentator couldn't even reply, just staring at the arena in silent horror. Some spectators cried, others screamed, watching the protagonist lift Hero's limp body by the neck. The commentator gasped, saying he looked dead, but the protagonist replied that Hero didn't need to pretend. He knew he was still alive. After all, he could see the health bar. Park looked into his rival's eyes and asked why he was after him. With his health regenerating, Hero growled that it was because he wanted to kill the protagonist. Confused, Park asked why. Hero's eyes turned blood red, and his health rose even more. Seething with hatred, he said Park deserved to die. The protagonist, stunned, demanded to know why. Then Hero's face began to twist, growing monstrous, as he revealed that a 500-year plan had been ruined because of him. Park's eyes widened. What plan? But Hero, now fully transformed into a monster, whispered to himself, "Monster break," and he roared that he had to save Earth. Everything around them was drenched in a blazing red glow. The The protagonist shook his head, saying the guy was completely insane. But the transformation finished. Hiro unleashed his divine rage. Space exploded like it was being ripped apart, hurling the protagonist backward. The energy pouring from Hiro was so intense that the stadium's glass shattered into thousands of shards, raining down on the crowd. Red lightning split the sky, tearing through walls and the ceiling. In the control room, the minister and the vice commander watched, tense. The minister commented that the potion that restored Hiro was dangerous, while the vice worried about another blast. Now, it wasn't Hiro anymore. It was a colossal beast with massive horns and a huge tail stomping through the arena. Seeing it, the minister muttered that from the look of that transformation, Hiro must have discovered some insane secrets on the planet Kuchan. After the impact, smoke covered everything. Groans of survivors echoed through the stadium. People cried, screamed for help. A little boy called for his mom, trapped under debris. Many had died in the blast. Even Akiko back in the waiting room was wounded when the huge glass window shattered. In the arena, Hiro, now a full monster, snarled that it was time for the final blow, the wrath of God. It was such an insane power that a human body couldn't withstand it. That's why he had to summon the beast. Hiro was shocked he needed to use it on just one man when he'd saved it for the boss of the 8th level. But then the monster heard a sound. Its eyes widened. Under the rubble, Park emerged, clutching his head and cursing the pain. Hiro, or rather the beast, stared in disbelief as Park, glowing with a green light, walked toward him. The protagonist looked at the beast and, with a furious grin, said that bastard really was something. Hiro couldn't believe he'd survived the wrath of God. Getting closer, Park taunted, calling the monster a bastard and saying he could transform too. Hiro, a mix of fear and rage in his eyes, growled and asked what item he'd used to get that strong. Hiro screamed, demanding to know what Park had used to regress. But the protagonist calmly replied that he had no idea what he was talking about. There was no regression item. What he had was a skill called Forest's Blessing. Hiro roared in disbelief, demanding how a skill could be stronger than an elixir. Park, with a calm smile, explained that it really was an elixir-level skill, able to fully restore all vitality and mana used in just 5 seconds. That made Hiro completely lose it. He yelled, asking if Park was actually smiling, but Park just raised an eyebrow, puzzled. Preparing to strike, Hiro snarled, demanding to know if he thought this was all some kind of joke. Meanwhile, the protagonist glanced at his status window, which confirmed that the monster before him was Hiro, a U-rank hybrid. Suddenly, the monster lunged, landing a hit that caught Park off guard. As he struck, Hiro screamed that the world had died because of him. Swinging his tail, he slammed Park, asking if he could still laugh. Raising his fist, he repeated the question, throwing punch after punch, but it was like they didn't even land. Park scoffed that a U-rank wasn't that strong anyway. Instantly, he landed a devastating kick to the monster's chin. He locked eyes with Hiro, asking if that so-called 500-year plan had been ruined because of him, and if that meant the planet's destruction was his fault too. Was that why he had to die at Hiro's hands? Stretching out his hand, Park released a green glow, forming a barrier against the wind. But Hiro, furious, said if he understood everything, then he should just die already. Suddenly, a strange purple stone appeared in Hiro's hand. He gripped it tightly, and a violet light surrounded the monster as he roared that Park had destroyed everything. He asked if he even knew how Hiro had reached that level, and how someone like Park dared talk down to him. Amid that chaos, Hiro remembered when he was just a baby, watching a superhero movie. The kids cheered as the hero landed the final blow. Even as a child, Hiro felt happy seeing the hero save the world. But suddenly, everyone gasped when the hero fell to his knees, bleeding. The screen showed everything burning. The narrator said the hero's soul stone would turn back time and he'd be forgotten, but it was okay as long as his loved ones could live. The kids cried, but Hiro didn't. He smiled, thinking that even if he was forgotten, it was enough for the world to remember a single hero. At that moment, Park's foot smashed straight into Hiro's face. His eyes widened in shock. The impact was so brutal, the monster was sent flying. Park, unfazed, repeated that he was just a lunatic. Hiro hit the ground face first, digging his claws in to stop himself from skidding farther. Coughing up blood, he slowly pushed himself up, staring at Park, admitting in his mind that he was strong. He couldn't believe there was someone he couldn't defeat. Not even in this monstrous form. He realized there was no sign of regression in Park, but it didn't matter. He could always start over. Right then, the protagonist landed another blow, asking what he was mumbling about. He said he wasn't the reason the plan failed, and from now on, he'd teach Hiro what real wisdom was. But the monster wasn't resisting for real. In his mind, Hiro was praying for him to keep talking. Meanwhile, the purple stone in his hand, the copy stone, had already reached 79% completion. It didn't just copy power, it absorbed the soul too. Hiro believed that in the next regression, he'd have Park's power under his control. He repeated to himself that only he could be the hero to save this world, but Park activated his reality ability. His hand glowed blue, black veins spread across his face, and suddenly, it wasn't a human hand smashing into Hiro's face, but a beast paw. Transformed into a massive bear, Park landed a punch so powerful, it sent the monster flying, breaking his nose and knocking out several teeth. Hiro's body crashed through a wall, landing on the other side, back in human form, right in the middle of the crowd, who stared at him with disgust, calling him a cruel monster. Hiro's hair turned white as he hit the ground, cursing when he realized the copy stone had shattered. A trickle of blood ran from one eye. He looked up at the sky, where an eagle circled overhead. It was Park, now in eagle form, slowly descending toward him, and in that moment, Hiro understood. He wasn't up against just another human. The protagonist dropped to his knees beside Hiro, who was sprawled out on the ground. With a faint smile, he asked if Hiro could finally see reality for what it was, but Hiro didn't get it at all and snapped back, saying it was just nonsense. Out of patience, the protagonist said firmly that Hiro better never show up in his territory again. If he did, he'd die next time. With blood-red eyes, Hiro whispered for him to shut up. But the protagonist shot back, calling him a delusional idiot, saying that anyone chained to the past had no future at all. Those words hit Hiro hard. His eyes widened as if he really heard them. The commentator narrated that even unconscious, Hiro seemed to hear every word as the protagonist, now in his eagle form, flew away from him. Meanwhile, Choi had watched the entire fight, clenching her fists in frustration. Only one question echoed in her mind. Why? She remembered that day in the hospital when she'd asked the protagonist why they couldn't fight together. He'd looked at her with pity, telling her she was still too weak. Their strengths weren't balanced. Someone would get hurt. Choi got even angrier remembering how he'd walked away with someone else right after saying that. As she left the room, she muttered under her breath, furious, that idiot always talked nonsense. Meanwhile, news headlines plastered screens everywhere with the protagonist's overwhelming victory. Articles reported that over 48 people had died in the stadium during the fight, and that the world's unofficial #1, Park, had donated his entire prize to Hiro's country. Another article said that the victims' families were preparing a class action lawsuit against Hiro. On a restless night, Hiro had a nightmare. In it, he saw the protagonist, transformed into a beast with claws, forbidding him from ever stepping foot in his territory again. For a guy stuck in the past like you, there is no future. Those words echoed in his mind, jolting him awake in a sweat. Sitting alone in his room, Hiro looked around, trying to figure out how long he'd been out. He grabbed his phone from the bedside and checked the news. Endless headlines about Park's victory and the lawsuit against the ex-champion. Reading the flood of hate-filled comments, Hiro let out a sarcastic laugh, mumbling that they were all hypocrites. Just then, Akiko walked in, relieved to see him up with his phone in hand. Without thinking twice, she snatched it away, begging him not to read any more of that garbage. She said people were just wounded in their pride. What he really needed was rest, more than anything else. Hiro realized she was trying to protect him. He didn't say anything, just let out a heavy sigh. She asked if he was okay. He said he wanted to be alone. Before leaving, Akiko told him she'd be taking the phone with her. Left alone, Hiro stared at the door for a long moment. Then he slowly stood up, walked over to the window, and pulled back the curtain. Outside, a mob held up signs, yelling at him to apologize and disappear. He thought bitterly that these people always chased after him, no matter how much of himself he gave. In the end, they never changed. He opened his status window and glared darkly at the copy stone. It showed the copy had been interrupted. He cursed under his breath, thinking that if he'd just held on a bit longer, he could have copied the protagonist completely. Then he stretched out his hand, and a red stone appeared. The dreaded regression stone. Before him, countless versions of Earth appeared, filling the room. With that stone, Hiro could go back 20 years, and now he saw no other choice. He had to eliminate Park once and for all. He figured he could activate the stone in 2 years, maybe sooner if he could level it up to 3. But his thoughts were cut short when 3 men walked into the room without knocking. Hiro recognized them instantly and greeted the man in the center, who asked if he was all right. Hiro replied bitterly that, in a way, he was, but demanded to know what was going on. The man said it was an order from the bureau. Hiro shot back that he hadn't received any notice. The man just shrugged, saying he didn't know either. He'd just been told to escort him. Hiro turned to the other 2 men, wanting to know why they were there too. One said they'd been called, the other muttered they'd bumped into each other on the way. In that tense silence, Hiro understood the real reason, and the two men avoided his eyes, too afraid to look at him directly. All the awakened Marine ranks were gathered there, and Hiro immediately realized this wasn't some ceremony to hand out awards. He stared at the men in front of him and told them to wait outside. He needed to get ready. The hooded man nodded, saying, "Of course," and started to leave the room with the others. The tallest one muttered under his breath that they'd better keep quiet, since two more were waiting outside. The hooded man tried to hush him, but it was too late. The third man let out a sigh, saying Hiro had already figured everything out. There was no point pretending anymore. With a smile that turned dark in an instant, Hiro asked if those five really thought they stood a chance against him. The hooded man tried to backpedal, insisting this was just an investigation and that he needed to cooperate. But Hiro's grin grew more twisted. He sneered, asking exactly who they thought they were investigating. The three men froze like statues, unable to answer. In Hiro's mind, it was obvious. The agency must have recorded his entire conversation with the protagonist on the day of the fight. Maybe they were after the items hidden in his inventory. He threw the question right at them. Did they really want his regression stone? Were they planning to lock him up and torture him for it? The hooded man stammered, denying it, saying it wasn't like that. It was just about some items missing from the reports. The tallest one snapped, "If you really have something like that, why not use it to help the people?" Those words made Hiro's eyes burn red with rage. An orb of energy formed in his palm. He growled that that line had crossed every limit. Soon, the whole country would know exactly what it lost because of that mistake. In an instant, the tall man tried to activate his abilities to restrain Hiro, but it was already too late. Small horns sprouted from Hiro's head as the energy around him pulsed violently. Outside, the two guards saw the light pouring through the door's window. A moment later, blood trickled through the cracks. As they ran to open the door, something exploded inside, blasting them back along with the door. Through the smoke, they could see what was left. Hiro, now transformed into a monster, had impaled the tall man with his tail while lifting the other one by the neck like he weighed nothing. "Do I still look weak just because I lost once?" the monster growled, making it clear he'd snap the neck of anyone who took another step. The hooded man reached out, begging, calling him captain, but the monster snarled that he didn't have the right to use that title anymore and demanded to know who gave the order. "It was the commissioner," the man stammered. "Tucker, the commissioner of the Supernatural Bureau. A patriot. He only cares about bloodlines. He waited for you to fail to have an excuse to strike." Tucker no longer trusted his loyalty. He said when Hiro's team cleared the 7th level of the dungeon, 9 died, and Hiro had transformed to heal them, but hid items and skills in the reports. To the commissioner, it was all lies. He wanted to know what else Hiro was hiding. The hooded man repeated Tucker's words. Before launching a full investigation, they had to interrogate Hiro, but the monster just laughed. "It's just greed," he spat. "That commissioner wanted every item for himself. I bet he would have offered me the captain's seat of the first squad if it had all gone his way." The man hesitated, remembering Tucker's empty promises about loyalty. The monster roared with laughter, calling them fools. He'd already watched this country be destroyed 25 times. He wanted to rebuild civilization right there. But how could he ever overcome human greed? Fuming, Hiro asked, "And Akiko, does she know everything?" The hooded man shut his eyes, clearly too scared to answer. The monster roared at him to speak up. With no way out, the man mumbled that yes, Akiko knew everything. Fury consumed Hiro, and he squeezed the man's neck until blood splattered the walls. The hooded man tried to shout his title to calm him, but it was far too late. The explosion that followed obliterated the entire room. The headlines blew up immediately. Hiro had escaped, killed 3 Marine ranks, and injured 2 others. Meanwhile, in the Supernatural Bureau, the commissioner stood at his window, growling under his breath. "Hiro, you ungrateful bastard. This is why you never help strangers. They'll stab you in the back." That's how Tucker summed it all up. They took the boy in, helped him, and yet he still had the nerve to bare his fangs at them. Tucker came to the conclusion that Hiro had always been a spy, planted there by his home country on purpose. The commissioner decided he now had enough proof to convince the prime minister. He figured that with this incident, he could get rid of multiple problems at once and create spotless new heroes to replace Hiro. He turned toward the door and called for his assistant in a booming voice. A young man came in immediately, asking what he needed to do. Tucker ordered him to contact every network. In 2 hours, there would be a press conference about Hiro. Meanwhile, headlines kept tracking Hiro's every move. One article claimed that the strongest man alive was now in Job. Another covered Yang, who was training new recruits, titled, "The Guild is overflowing with fresh blood." A third reported that the countdown for Job to become the 13th district had officially begun. On YouTube, a video analyzed the expansion of Park's guild, calling it the job version. In another, a real estate expert said this expansion was only natural. One more clip broke down Park's fight, titled, "The Dragon Knight Seeks Divine Powers." monsters. Han was glued to all of it, amazed at how much information was pouring out. All 10 of the most watched videos were about Park. Grinning, he whispered that this was next-level, global fame. But then he stumbled across a headline saying Hero had escaped from the hospital. A TV anchor announced that Tucker had called a press conference and suggested they listen in. The commissioner accused Hero of being a spy and demanded an explanation for Park's so-called terrorist attack. In response, the government spokesperson fired back, calling the accusation absurd and saying the country was outraged by the insult. Han sighed, listening closely to the minister's words, but a chill ran down his spine when he realized Hero had vanished. He thought, how could a guy who was nearly dead show up again? And what if he returned when Park wasn't at the guild? A shiver crawled up Han's back, and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Without wasting another second, he bolted from the office, determined to find Park. He tore through the forest, grumbling that Park always disappeared when things got ugly, wondering why he couldn't just stay home for once in his life. Suddenly, blue lightning bolts began to streak across the sky. Han froze, mouth hanging open, an eerie fear creeping up his spine. The scene felt way too familiar. Then, a massive bolt struck the ground, and screams echoed from deep in the woods. A swarm of workers burst out of the forest, sprinting straight at Han, yelling at him to run too. Seeing that, Han knew for sure. That lunatic was already there. Terrified, he kept repeating to himself that the madman was back. In the chaos, Han pushed past everyone and ran straight into Yang, who seemed to appear out of nowhere. They stared at each other. Shocked, breathless, Han spilled out what he'd seen, saying that the crazy Hero was back. But Yang just frowned. He'd gotten a report that a portal had opened nearby and was going to check it out. Han repeated portal, just as confused as the workers running past. Zhang nodded. They turned and stared, stunned, as the lightning kept slamming into the ground. Suddenly, a red sphere began forming inside the glowing storm. Both of them stood frozen, speechless. Han swallowed hard and whispered that the portal looked terrifying. A soldier in gear walked up and told them it was a level 7 portal that would explode in 42 days. Choi shouted that was way too long, while Junho reminded everyone that the same kind of portal had already produced 23 gates and lasted 120 days. The guys freaked out. There were too many people and not enough time. Junho complained that they'd been so busy with the 13th district that they hadn't even checked the skills of the people they'd hired. If a rupture happened, they couldn't guarantee survival. Only Monk stayed calm. He said they had no choice but to face it and clear everything before disaster struck. No one had the courage to answer. Monk asked if Park would allow this to happen. Zhang sighed, saying first they'd have to make it back alive. Han, trembling, asked if they really planned to walk into that hell. He admitted he was still a pathetic rank E, and Yang said he was too. Zhang grumbled, asking where Park was when they needed him most. Han muttered that he'd keep looking. Junyo said he'd check the animal farm and walked off. Monk said he'd scout the east side, and Yang decided to head for the entrance. The guys spread out in different directions, but none of them noticed the tiny ferret right in the middle of them all. It looked just like Park, and as if they could feel the ferret's gaze, the group slowly turned around. Park's voice, coming from his ferret form, asked why they'd decided to accept that territory in the first place. Juno answered that it was because they'd gotten blinded by the chance to be the 13th district. Han admitted he'd fallen for the manager title too, and the others quickly agreed. But Park immediately cut them off. That wasn't it. The real reason was that the place was actually a massive hunting ground. The boys froze, realizing what that meant. The ferret said it was obvious why that location had been picked, and he admitted he liked how they thought. He invited them to feel the raw wildness of that land for themselves. Monk even closed his eyes, breathed deep, and smiled into the wind. Park, still a ferret, told them there was a massive prize waiting right on their path. He asked if they shouldn't be hunting with grateful hearts for that. Han said they were thankful, but their levels right now. Park interrupted him. The prey stretches out its neck, begging to be caught, yet they still wanted to run. He told them that if they kept living like that, they'd just run forever, right back to the miserable lives they used to have. Those words hit Monk like a knife, and he widened his eyes as Park asked again, did they really want to go back to how things were before? Immediately, they all shouted no in unison. They said they'd never go back, not after fighting so hard to get there. Han rolled up his sleeves, ready to jump into the dungeon right then, and Monk offered to be the scout. Suddenly, the ferret shone with a blue light, and everyone froze. Right where the little creature was, Park's human silhouette appeared. He smiled and warned them that since it was their first level 7 dungeon, they'd probably need some time to get ready. The guys switched their tune immediately, saying they needed time to get organized and stock up on hot meals. Park told them someone would have to train the rookies and oversee construction too, so Yang and Monk would go in on the first run. Everyone shouted back excitedly that they understood and dashed off to get ready. Han, sulking, grumbled that he was sad his name wasn't on the roster for the country's first level 7 raid team. But Park told him he was going too, which didn't exactly make him happy. Our hero stepped toward the dungeon entrance and announced they were going in now. Han tried to stop him, begging to wait, but Park ignored him and walked through the portal. With no choice, the guys started filing in after him, Han running in last. Junho, fired up, asked if it was really okay to just dive into a level 7 dungeon like that. Monk, right behind him, just shrugged. Park and Jang were already inside, wrapped in a faint pink glow, with Han trailing behind, yelling at them to wait up. On the other side of the portal, their silhouettes appeared. Park stepped out first, scanning the terrain, with Jang and Han right behind him, eyes narrowed and alert. Suddenly, a skeletal monster leaped at them, reaching out a bony hand. Han was so freaked out he forgot what to say, letting out an incomprehensible scream instead. On the info screen, a message popped up. They just entered the lands of the undead. Outside, the people monitoring them saw the same thing and froze in fear. On TV, the anchor announced that this was the first level 7 dungeon in Park's country, and only the 8th in the world. He said it was expected, and now the international airport was packed with people trying to flee. The live broadcast showed the chaos, a man shouting that there were no tickets left, and a woman begging desperately for them to open a sea route. The reporter looked confused, saying the tension in the country was only just beginning. Meanwhile, Park's guild had already stepped inside the dungeon. Back at headquarters, the top brass argued whether the team had made the right call going in so soon. The agency head asked if Park's group had really made the right choice. The assistant confirmed. Park, Han, and Yang were inside. One man lowered his head, listing their ranks, and another asked why Park had taken them in. Someone pointed out that Han had a video memory skill. The chief shook his head, saying at least they'd leave recordings for the next teams. And now, there were already tons of videos online showing raids in level 7 dungeons.